My name is Robert, and today I'm going to tell you about the day my 5-year-old daughter died in my arms, and how, in the darkest moment of my life, God showed me something that shattered everything I'd believed for 42 years. Before we go further, if this story touches your heart, please subscribe to this channel, share it with someone who needs hope, and leave a comment about your own journey with loss and faith. Your story matters. I was 42 years old, living in Boston, working as a neuroscientist at a major research hospital, and I was an atheist. Not the quiet, keep-it-to-yourself kind. I was vocal, confident, and completely certain that death was the end. That consciousness was nothing more than electrical impulses in the brain, that when the brain stopped, the person stopped. No heaven, no afterlife, just nothing. My wife, Rachel, had grown up Christian, but she'd stopped going to church years ago. We'd agreed to raise our daughter Lily without religion. Let her decide for herself when she's old enough, we'd said. But really, I'd been confident she'd arrive at the same rational, scientific conclusion I had, that God was a comforting myth people told themselves because they couldn't face the finality of death. Lily was 5 years old. Beautiful, brilliant, full of life and questions. She had my curiosity and Rachel's warmth. She loved dinosaurs and space and asking why about everything. She was perfect until she wasn't. It started with headaches. Lily would come home from kindergarten holding her head, saying it hurt. We took her to the pediatrician. Probably just tension headaches, the doctor said. Kids get stressed too. Give her some children's ibuprofen. But the headaches got worse. Then came the nausea, the dizziness, the moments where she'd lose her balance for no reason. I'm a neuroscientist. I know the warning signs, but I didn't want to see them. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overreacting, that my medical knowledge was making me paranoid. Until the day Lily had a seizure at preschool. The MRI showed what I'd been refusing to believe, a brain tumor. Diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma, DIPG, one of the worst diagnoses a child can receive. Inoperable, untreatable, fatal. How long? Rachel asked the oncologist, her voice breaking. 6 to 12 months, typically. I'm so sorry. I heard the words from somewhere far away. This couldn't be happening. Not to Lily, not to our perfect, brilliant, beautiful girl who still believed in magic and asked me every night to tell her about the stars. I threw myself into research. I was a scientist. There had to be something, some experimental treatment, some clinical trial, some way to fix this. I contacted colleagues around the world. I read every paper on DIPG. I analyzed data. I looked for patterns. I was going to solve this. I was going to save her, because the alternative, accepting that my daughter was going to die, that there was nothing I could do, that all my education and knowledge and expertise were useless, that was unbearable. Rachel wanted to pray. She'd started going to church again, taking Lily with her. It gives us comfort, she'd say. It gives us hope. False hope, I'd respond. Rachel, there's no one listening to those prayers, no God who's going to intervene. We need to focus on real solutions, medical solutions. Robert, even if there's no cure, Lily needs comfort. She needs to believe there's something beyond this, that she's not just ending. She's 5 years old. She doesn't understand death. We shouldn't fill her head with fantasies about heaven. She's dying, Robert. Let her have hope. We fought constantly during those months. Rachel clinging to faith, me clinging to science. Both of us terrified, both of us watching our daughter fade. The tumor progressed quickly. Lily lost her ability to walk, then to speak clearly, then to swallow. We moved her to hospice care at home because I refused to let her die in a hospital. I took a leave of absence from work. I spent every moment with Lily, reading to her, playing her favorite music, holding her hand, telling her about the stars even though I wasn't sure she could understand anymore. And I was angry, furious at the universe, at the randomness of cellular mutation, at the cruel reality that a beautiful 5-year-old could be destroyed by her own biology. Rachel would sit by Lily's bed and pray, and I would stand in the doorway watching, feeling nothing but rage. If there was a God, I thought, and he let this happen to an innocent child, he'd be a monster. It's better that he doesn't exist. The end came on a Tuesday morning in October, 3 months after the diagnosis, faster than anyone had expected. I was holding Lily in my arms. Rachel was beside us, tears streaming down her face, praying. Lily's breathing had become shallow, labored. I could see in her vital signs that she didn't have long. "Daddy," Lily whispered, one of the few words she could still speak. Her eyes were half open, unfocused. "I'm here, sweetheart. Daddy's here." "Pretty." "What's pretty, Lily?" But she didn't answer. Her eyes were looking at something I couldn't see. And then I felt it, the moment her breathing changed, the moment the struggle stopped. I'm a neuroscientist. I've studied death. I've observed it. I understand the physiological process, the cessation of brain activity, the shutdown of body systems. I knew what was happening, but knowing didn't prepare me for the reality of feeling my daughter's body go still in my arms, of watching the life leave her eyes, of experiencing the moment when she stopped being Lily and became just a body. I held her for a long time. Rachel was sobbing. I was silent, empty, hollowed out. This was it. The end I'd always said was coming. Death, final, absolute. Lily was gone. My beautiful girl who'd loved dinosaurs and asked questions about the stars. She was just gone. And I'd been right all along. There was no God to prevent this, no heaven waiting for her, just the cold reality of biological processes ending. I should have felt vindicated in my atheism, proven right. But I felt nothing except grief so deep it seemed to have no bottom. The hospice nurse came and did what needed to be done, made phone calls, handled arrangements. Rachel and I sat in Lily's room, which would never be Lily's room again, and didn't speak. Later, after the funeral home had taken Lily's body, I stood in the nursery we decorated when she was born. The walls still had the stars I'd painted, constellations I'd planned to teach her about, the books we'd read together, the toys she'd loved, all of it meaningless now, just objects left behind by a consciousness that no longer existed. I'd spent my career studying the brain, understanding how it creates the illusion of self, of consciousness, of personhood, and I'd always believed that when the brain died, all of that simply ceased. Now I knew it was true, because I'd held my daughter as she ceased to exist, and the certainty of that truth, that Lily was simply gone, that there was no heaven, no reunion, no better place, it was crushing me. I didn't know then that I was wrong, that I'd been wrong about everything, that in 3 days God would show me something that would shatter every certainty I'd built my life on. I didn't know that Lily's death wasn't the end of her story, but I was about to find out, and it would change everything. The 3 days after Lily died were the longest of my life, not because of the grief, though that was crushing, but because of the emptiness, the absolute hollow void where my daughter used to be. Rachel threw herself into planning the funeral, choosing flowers, picking out a dress for Lily to be buried in, writing an obituary. She moved through it all with a kind of numb determination, tears constantly streaming down her face. I couldn't do any of it. I couldn't think about putting Lily in the ground, couldn't imagine standing at a funeral and listening to people say she was in a better place when I knew with scientific certainty that she was nowhere. She simply didn't exist anymore. So I did what I always did when faced with something unbearable. I buried myself in work. Not my actual job. I was still on leave. But research, data, science. I pulled up my files on consciousness studies, read papers on what happens to the brain at death, analyzed neurological data on the cessation of brain activity, as if understanding the mechanism would somehow make it hurt less. It didn't. Rachel found me at 2 a.m. on the second night, sitting at my desk, surrounded by printouts and journal articles. "Robert, what are you doing?" "Research. There's a new study on cellular death in the cerebral cortex that—" "Stop." Her voice was sharp. "Just stop. Our daughter is dead, and you're reading about brain cells." I'm trying to understand. Understand what? That she's gone? We already know that. What we need to understand is how to survive this. How to keep breathing when our child isn't. Science helps me process. Science isn't going to bring her back. Rachel's voice cracked. And it's not going to comfort us. It's not going to give us any hope that this nightmare has meaning. It's just cold facts about dying brain cells. Is that all Lily was to you? Brain cells? Her words hit like a physical blow. Of course not. Rachel, you're hiding, like you always do. Behind your research and your data and your certainty that you understand everything. But you don't understand this. You can't explain away grief with neuroscience. She left me sitting there, and I stared at the papers on my desk. She was right. None of it helped. None of it made Lily any less gone, but it was all I had. Because the alternative, sitting with the grief, accepting that my daughter was dead, and there was nothing I could do or understand that would change it, that was unbearable. The funeral was on the third day. A small service at a church Rachel had been attending, one I'd never set foot in. I'd fought her on having it in a church at all. Lily never believed in God, I'd said. This is dishonest. Lily was 5 years old. She didn't have the chance to believe or not believe, but I believe, and I need this. Please, Robert, let me have this. So I went, and I sat in the front row of a building dedicated to what I considered a comforting delusion, and I listened to a pastor who'd never met Lily talk about heaven and God's love and how Lily was at peace. Every word felt like a lie, like a betrayal of reality, like people desperately grasping for meaning in the meaningless. The only moment I nearly broke was when they opened the casket for final viewing. Rachel had dressed Lily in her favorite purple dress, the one she'd worn to her 5th birthday party 2 months ago. She looked like she was sleeping, peaceful. But I knew better. I knew that wasn't Lily anymore. Just the biological shell she'd inhabited. The neurons that had created her consciousness, her personality, her Lilyness. They were dead. What lay in that casket was just matter, organic material that would decompose. She looks beautiful, Rachel whispered beside me. I couldn't respond, because all I could think was, she looks like nothing, because she is nothing now, just the absence where a person used to be. After the funeral, people came to our house, neighbors, friends, colleagues. They brought food and flowers and sympathy, and every single one of them said some version of, she's in a better place now, or God needed another angel, or she's watching over you from heaven. I wanted to scream at them, to tell them to stop lying, that Lily wasn't anywhere, that she wasn't watching anything because she didn't exist anymore, that their platitudes were just ways to avoid facing the brutal reality of death. But I didn't. I just stood there, nodding numbly, while Rachel accepted their condolences and thanked them for coming. By the time everyone left, I was exhausted, not from grief. I'd learned to compartmentalize that, to push it down where it couldn't touch me, but from the effort of not challenging every religious comfort people had offered. That night, I couldn't sleep. Rachel had finally fallen into an exhausted sleep around midnight, but I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind refusing to quiet. I kept seeing Lily's face in those final moments, the way she'd looked at something I couldn't see, the word she'd whispered, pretty. What had she been seeing? Nothing, obviously. The dying brain creates hallucinations, I knew that. Oxygen deprivation causes vivid imagery. It was well documented, but the word haunted me. Pretty. What final firing of neurons had created that perception? Around 2 a.m. I gave up on sleep and went downstairs. I made coffee and sat in the living room where Lily used to play. Her toys were still scattered around. Rachel hadn't been able to put them away yet. A stuffed dinosaur, building blocks, the telescope I'd bought her to look at stars. I picked up the dinosaur, a purple T-Rex she'd named Chompy. She'd slept with it every night since her 3rd birthday. I held it, and for the first time since she'd died, I felt the grief break through the compartments I'd built. I cried, really cried. Not the silent tears I'd allowed myself at the funeral, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere I didn't know existed. "She's gone," I said out loud to the empty room. "She's really gone, and there's nothing, no heaven, no God, no reunion someday, just gone, forever." The finality of it crushed me, because I'd built my entire worldview on that finality. Death as the end, no afterlife, no continuation of consciousness. Just the cessation of brain activity and the decomposition of organic matter. I'd always found that truth clean, honest, free from the need for comforting delusions. But now, holding my daughter's stuffed dinosaur, that truth felt like torture, because it meant Lily was truly gone. That I'd never see her again, never hear her laugh, never answer another of her questions about the stars, never hold her or read to her or watch her grow up. Never, because when brain activity ceased, the person ceased. That's what I'd always believed. That's what the science showed. And I'd been so certain it was true. But in that moment, sitting alone in the dark, holding Chompy, I found myself doing something I hadn't done since I was a child. I prayed. Not because I believed anyone was listening, but because the grief was so overwhelming that I needed to speak it out loud to something, anything, even if that something was just the empty universe. "If you're there," I said to the ceiling, to God, to whatever might exist beyond the material world I'd dedicated my life to studying, "if there's any chance I'm wrong about all of this, show me, because I can't live with this. I can't accept that Lily is just gone. That all her brightness and curiosity and love just ended, that there's no purpose to any of this, that she suffered and died, and it meant nothing." I felt ridiculous even as I said it, talking to a God I didn't believe in, begging for signs from a being I'd spent decades arguing against. But I also felt desperate, willing to grasp at anything, even the possibility I'd been wrong about everything if it meant Lily's death wasn't the absolute end I'd always believed it to be. "Show me," I whispered again, "please, if she's anywhere, if there's anything beyond this, show me." I sat there in the silence, waiting. For what? I didn't know. A voice? A sign? Some mystical experience? Nothing happened. Of course nothing happened, because there was no one listening, no God to answer desperate prayers from grieving atheists. I was alone in the dark, holding my dead daughter's toy, talking to myself. Eventually, exhaustion won. I fell asleep on the couch, still clutching Chompy, my face wet with tears, and I had a dream. I was standing in Lily's room, not as it was now, empty and still, but as it had been when she was alive, full of her presence and energy, and Lily was there, not sick, not struggling, but healthy, whole, radiant. She was wearing her purple dress, the one we'd buried her in, and she was smiling. "Daddy!" she said, running to me. I knelt down and she threw her arms around me. She felt real, solid, warm. Not like the cold body I'd held 3 days ago. "Lily, but you're—" "I'm okay, Daddy. I'm more than okay. It's so pretty here." Pretty. The same word she'd said before she died. "Where is here, sweetheart?" "I don't know the name, but Jesus is here. And Grandma, your mom, Daddy. She says she's been waiting to meet me. And there are so many colors we didn't have at home." This was just a dream. I knew it was a dream. My grieving brain creating comfort because I couldn't handle reality. But it felt so real. Lily felt so present. "Daddy, I need to tell you something." Her expression became serious, the way it used to when she was explaining something very important about dinosaurs. "You were wrong. About everything. There is more. So much more. And you need to know that I'm not gone. I'm just different. I'm here. And someday you and Mommy will be here too. But not yet. You have to stay there. You have important things to do." What things?" "Lily, I don't understand." "You will. Jesus is going to show you. But you have to be willing to see. You have to stop trying to explain everything and just see." She hugged me again, and I held her tight. This dream Lily, who felt more real than anything I'd experienced since she died. "I love you, Daddy. Tell Mommy I love her too. And tell her she was right. About all of it. She was right." Then I woke up. I was still on the couch, still holding Chompy. Dawn light was filtering through the windows, and I was crying, not from grief this time, but from something else, something I couldn't name. It was just a dream, obviously, a grief dream. My brain processing loss by creating a comforting scenario where Lily was okay, but it had felt so real, and her words, "You were wrong about everything," they echoed in my mind. I sat up, disoriented. Rachel was standing in the doorway, watching me. "Robert, are you okay?" I had a dream about Lily. Rachel came and sat beside me. "Tell me." So I did. I told her everything. The prayer I'd prayed, the dream, Lily's words, all of it. When I finished, Rachel was crying. She said I was right. About what? About God, about heaven, about all of it. Rachel took my hand. "Robert, what if it wasn't just a dream?" It was a dream, obviously. My brain creating comfort because, what if it wasn't? Rachel insisted. "What if God answered your prayer? What if he showed you that Lily's okay?" I wanted to dismiss it, to explain it away with neuroscience and grief psychology, to return to my certainty that there was a rational explanation for everything. But I couldn't, because something about that dream had felt different, more real than real, like I'd actually seen Lily, touched her, heard her voice. "I don't know," I admitted. It was the first time in my adult life I'd said those words about something I'd previously been certain about. I don't know what it was. And in that admission, that tiny crack in my certainty, something began to shift. I didn't know it yet, but God wasn't done showing me where Lily was. The dream was just the beginning. The days after the dream were strange. I couldn't shake it, couldn't dismiss it the way I wanted to. Couldn't explain it away with the psychological mechanisms I knew should account for it. I tried. God knows I tried. I pulled up research on grief dreams, on how the bereaved brain creates vivid experiences of deceased loved ones as a coping mechanism, on the neuroscience of REM sleep and how emotional trauma affects dream content, on the psychological need for closure manifesting as imagined conversations. All of it made perfect sense. All of it should have explained the dream. But none of it explained why it had felt so different from any dream I'd ever had. Why Lily's presence had felt more real than her absence. Why her words, "You were wrong about everything," kept echoing in my mind with the weight of truth rather than wishful thinking. Rachel noticed my struggle. "You're researching the dream, aren't you?" "I'm trying to understand it." "What if you can't understand it? What if some things aren't meant to be analyzed, but experienced?" "Everything can be analyzed. Everything has a rational explanation." "Does it?" She looked at me with something like pity. "Robert, for 42 years you've believed you had everything figured out, that science explained everything, that death was the end. What if you were wrong, not about some minor detail, but about the fundamental nature of reality? Then my entire career, my entire worldview, everything I've built my life on would be what? Less important than the possibility that our daughter still exists somewhere, that she's okay, that we'll see her again." I couldn't answer that, because she was right. If there was even a chance, even the smallest possibility, that Lily continued to exist beyond death, it would be worth abandoning every certainty I'd ever held. But abandoning those certainties felt like dying myself, like losing my identity. Who was Robert the neuroscientist without his atheism, his scientific materialism, his certainty about the nature of consciousness and death? The answer terrified me. I didn't know. A week after the dream, Rachel asked me to go to church with her. "I can't," I said automatically. "Why not?" "Because I don't believe in it. It would be dishonest." "You don't have to believe. Just come. Sit with me. Let me not be alone in this." The way she said it, the loneliness in her voice, broke something in me. She'd lost Lily, too. And while I'd been drowning in research and analysis, she'd been grieving without me, turning to faith while I'd turned to science, finding comfort in a church community while I'd isolated myself in certainty. "Okay," I said. "I'll come." That Sunday, I walked into a church for the first time since Lily's funeral. It was a medium-sized congregation, maybe 200 people. Contemporary worship music played. People stood with hands raised, singing about God's love and faithfulness. I stood there awkwardly, hands in my pockets, feeling like an imposter. These people believed, really believed, in God, in heaven, in eternal life. And I was a scientist who'd spent decades arguing that their beliefs were comforting delusions. But then I looked at Rachel beside me. She was singing, tears streaming down her face, and I realized her faith wasn't making the grief less. She was still devastated, still broken by Lily's death, but she had something I didn't: hope. The belief that Lily's death wasn't the end, that there was meaning in the suffering, that she'd see our daughter again. I envied that hope. Even as my rational mind rejected it, I envied it. The pastor, a man in his 50s named David, preached about suffering and faith, about how God doesn't always prevent pain, but walks through it with us, about how Jesus himself experienced loss and grief. Some of you are here today carrying grief so heavy you can barely breathe, he said, and I felt like he was speaking directly to me. And you're wondering where God is in this pain, why he didn't prevent it, why he allowed the person you love to die. Yes, that was exactly what I was wondering, though I'd phrase it differently. Why did random cellular mutations destroy my daughter's brain? Not why did God allow it, because there was no God to allow or prevent anything, just biology, just the indifferent universe. I can't give you answers that will make the pain go away, Pastor David continued, but I can tell you this: God is not distant in your suffering. He's present. He's weeping with you. And he's holding the person you lost in perfect love. They're not gone. They're more alive than they've ever been. They're home. The congregation murmured amens. Rachel squeezed my hand, and I felt something unexpected: anger. Not at the randomness of the universe, but at this God they claimed existed. If he was real, if he was as loving and powerful as they said, why hadn't he saved Lily? Why had he let a 5-year-old suffer and die? After the service, Rachel wanted to stay for coffee and conversation. I stood awkwardly in the fellowship hall while people introduced themselves. "You're Rachel's husband," a woman said, approaching with sympathy in her eyes. "I'm so sorry about Lily. We've been praying for your family." "Thank you," I said, because it seemed like the right response, even though I wanted to ask, "What good did your prayers do?" "She's still dead." Pastor David approached. "Robert, right. Rachel's told me about you. I'm glad you came today. My wife asked me to. I don't believe in any of this. I appreciate the honesty. Can I ask what you do believe?" "I'm a neuroscientist. I believe in what can be measured, tested, verified. Consciousness is an emergent property of brain activity. When the brain dies, consciousness ceases. There's no soul, no afterlife, no God, just biology." I expected him to be offended or to launch into a defense of faith. Instead, he nodded thoughtfully. "That's a consistent worldview, and it worked for you until it didn't." "What do you mean?" "You lost your daughter, and your worldview says she simply ceased to exist. That all her personality, her love, her essence, it's just gone, forever. And that belief isn't giving you any comfort, is it? Comfort doesn't make something true. No, it doesn't. But what if truth is bigger than what you've allowed yourself to see? What if your scientific framework is like a tool that's very good at measuring certain things but completely inadequate for measuring others? Like what? Like love. Like consciousness itself. You say it's emergent, but you can't actually explain how subjective experience arises from physical matter. Like meaning. Like the human soul. Science is excellent at answering how questions, but it's not designed to answer why questions. Why does anything exist? Why do we love? Why does suffering matter? Those are questions that require a different kind of truth. Or they're just questions we ask because our brains evolved to seek patterns and meaning, even where none exist. Maybe, or maybe your brain evolved to recognize truth, including truths beyond the material world. Robert, I'm not going to try to convince you of anything, but I will ask you this. Are you willing to consider that you might be wrong? That there might be more to reality than what your instruments can measure? Before I could answer, he smiled, and moved on to talk with other people. Rachel found me standing alone, processing the conversation. "What did Pastor David say to you?" "He asked if I was willing to consider I might be wrong. And I don't know. Part of me wants to say no. That would mean everything I've built my career on is flawed. But another part of me," I paused, struggling to articulate it. "Another part of me desperately wants to be wrong, because if I'm wrong, then Lily might still exist somewhere. And that possibility, even if it's unlikely, is worth more than being right." Rachel's eyes filled with tears. "That's the first time I've heard you even consider the possibility." That night, I couldn't sleep again. I kept thinking about Pastor David's question. Was I willing to consider I might be wrong? The scientific method required being open to evidence that contradicted your hypothesis. I'd spent my career testing theories, revising conclusions based on new data, admitting when my initial assumptions were incorrect, but I'd never applied that same rigor to my atheism. I'd assumed it was true and interpreted all evidence through that lens. Any experience that suggested otherwise, mystical experiences, answered prayers, near-death experiences, I'd explained away as neurological phenomena or psychological coping mechanisms. What if I'd been doing the opposite of science? What if I'd been defending a conclusion rather than following the evidence? The thought was uncomfortable. More than uncomfortable. It was threatening. Because if I was wrong about God, I was wrong about everything. I got up and went to Lily's room. We'd left it exactly as it had been. Rachel couldn't bear to pack it up yet. I sat on Lily's bed, surrounded by her things. "I don't know how to do this," I said out loud, not sure if I was talking to God or to Lily or to myself. "I don't know how to believe in things I can't measure. I don't know how to have faith. I'm a scientist. I need evidence." And then I felt it. A warmth. Not physical heat, but something else. A presence. A sense that I wasn't alone in the room. My rational mind immediately started analyzing. Grief hallucination, psychological projection, wishful thinking creating a sensory experience. But the presence didn't fade. It grew stronger, and with it came a thought that wasn't mine, or at least didn't feel like it came from me. "You have evidence. You're just afraid to accept it." The dream. The way Lily had said pretty before she died, looking at something I couldn't see. The peace on her face in those final moments. Rachel's faith sustaining her through grief. The feeling I'd had holding Chompy when I prayed. None of it was scientific proof. None of it would convince my colleagues. None of it was measurable or testable. But it was evidence. Different kind of evidence than I was used to. Subjective rather than objective. Experiential rather than empirical. And if I was honest, really honest, I had to admit it was evidence I'd been systematically dismissing because it didn't fit my conclusions. "Okay," I whispered to the presence, to God, to whatever or whoever might be listening. "I'm willing to consider I'm wrong. I'm willing to look at the evidence I've been ignoring. I'm willing to try. I don't know how to believe, but I'm willing to try." The warmth intensified, and in my mind I heard or felt words. "That's all I ask. Stay open. I'll show you more." I sat there for a long time, experiencing something I couldn't explain, and for the first time in my adult life, not immediately trying to explain it away. When I finally went back to bed, Rachel was awake. "Where were you?" "Lily's room." I think I felt something. Maybe God. Maybe my grief creating an experience. I don't know. But Rachel, I told him, or it, or whatever, that I'm willing to consider I'm wrong, that I'm willing to look at evidence I've been dismissing. Rachel sat up, hopeful. "Robert, that's huge. I'm not saying I believe. I'm just saying I'm willing to be open to the possibility. That's all faith is at the beginning, being willing to be open." Over the next week, I started doing something I'd never done before. I read the Bible, not as literature or historical document, but as a possible source of truth. I started with the Gospels, the accounts of Jesus' life, and I found myself surprised by what I read. Jesus wasn't the figure I'd imagined from my dismissive view of Christianity. He was radical, challenging. He called out religious hypocrisy. He spent time with outcasts. He asked hard questions. And he talked about death not as an ending, but as a transition, about a kingdom beyond this world, about eternal life that started now, not just after death. If any of it was true, if even a fraction of it was true, it changed everything. I also started paying attention to Rachel's faith in a new way, not dismissing it as coping mechanism, but watching how it actually affected her, and I saw something I'd missed before. Her faith didn't make her pretend everything was okay. She grieved deeply. She cried. She struggled. But she grieved with hope, with the belief that Lily's death wasn't meaningless, that we'd see her again, that God was somehow working even in this tragedy, and that hope, even if I couldn't share it yet, was sustaining her in a way my scientific certainty never could. One evening I told Rachel what I'd been learning. I'm reading the Bible, trying to approach it openly instead of dismissively. What are you finding? That it's more complex than I thought, that Jesus is different than I assumed, and that maybe there's something here worth considering. Robert, I've been praying for years that you'd be open to this. I never imagined it would take losing Lily to get you there. I wouldn't say I'm there yet. I'm just open. Willing to look at evidence I'd previously dismissed, willing to consider that my materialist worldview might be incomplete. That's more than I hoped for. God can work with willing. That night, I prayed again, more intentionally this time. God, if you're real, if you exist, and if you care about a grieving scientist who spent decades arguing against you, show me more. Show me where Lily is. Show me that she's okay. Give me something I can hold on to, because I want to believe. I'm starting to want to believe more than I want to be right, and that terrifies me. I fell asleep, waiting for an answer, and God, though I didn't fully realize it yet, was about to give me one that would shatter every remaining certainty I had, and rebuild my understanding of reality from the ground up. The answer came 3 days later, in the most unexpected way possible. I was back at work, not full-time, but a few hours a day. My colleagues had been understanding about the leave, but I needed something to occupy my mind, beyond grief and theological questions I didn't know how to answer. I was in my lab, reviewing brain scans from a research study on consciousness, when my colleague Dr. Sarah Martinez came to find me. "Robert, there's someone here to see you. She says it's urgent. I'm not really taking meetings right now. She says it's about Lily." My heart stopped. What? Who is she? She wouldn't give her name. Just said she had to talk to you about your daughter. She's in the conference room. I followed Sarah down the hall, my mind racing. Who would come to my workplace to talk about Lily? A reporter? Someone from the funeral home? It didn't make sense. The woman in the conference room was probably in her 60s, with kind eyes and an air of calm certainty. She stood when I entered. "Dr. Harrison, thank you for seeing me. My name is Margaret Chen. I know this is going to sound strange, but I need to tell you about something that happened to me 3 days ago. Regarding my daughter?" "Yes, Dr. Harrison, I don't know how else to say this, so I'm just going to be direct. 3 nights ago, I had a vision, and your daughter was in it. I felt my scientific skepticism snap back into place like armor. A vision. You had a vision of my dead daughter. I know how this sounds. I'm a nurse. I work in pediatric oncology at Children's Hospital. I'm not given to mystical experiences or religious fanaticism, but 3 nights ago I was praying and I saw her. Clear as day, a little girl in a purple dress with curly brown hair. She was radiant, happy, and she told me I needed to find you and give you a message. My skin went cold. "What did you say she was wearing?" "A purple dress." "Why? Describe the girl you saw." Margaret pulled out her phone and showed me a sketch. "I drew this after the vision because I knew I'd need to prove I actually saw her. I'm not an artist, but..." The sketch showed Lily. Not perfectly. The proportions were a bit off, and the details weren't exact. But it was unmistakably her. The curly hair, the shape of her face, even the purple dress, the one we'd buried her in. "How did you..." I couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't. I've never seen a photo of your daughter. I didn't know what she looked like. But she appeared to me and told me her name was Lily, that her daddy was a scientist who didn't believe in heaven, and that I needed to tell you she's okay, that she's with Jesus, that she wants you to know she's more alive now than she ever was before. I sat down heavily. This couldn't be happening. There had to be a rational explanation. How did you find me? She told me your name, Dr. Robert Harrison, neuroscientist in Boston. I looked you up, found where you worked, and came here. Dr. Harrison, I know this sounds insane. If someone had told me a story like this a week ago, I wouldn't have believed it either. But I saw her, as clearly as I'm seeing you right now, and she was desperate for you to know she's not gone. This is impossible. You must have seen an obituary, seen a photo somewhere. I specifically didn't look. I didn't want to contaminate what I saw. I drew the sketch before I even searched for you. Dr. Harrison, I'm not here to convince you of anything. I'm just delivering a message because a little girl who loves you very much asked me to. What else did she say? Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She said to tell you that she saw you in her room, that she knows you felt her presence, that God is answering your prayers, but you have to stop being so afraid to believe. She said, Margaret paused, checking her phone where she'd apparently written notes. She said, tell Daddy that Chompy misses me too, but he should give him to another little girl who needs him. I don't need him anymore because I have everything here. My hands started shaking. What did you just say? Chompy. She said you'd know what that meant. No one knew about Chompy except me and Rachel. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Not colleagues, not friends, not even at the funeral. It was the stuffed dinosaur I'd been holding when I prayed. The one I'd cried over. The one I still kept on my nightstand. How could you possibly know about that? I don't know about it, Lily told me. She said you'd been holding Chompy when you asked God to show you where she was. And she wanted you to know that God heard you. That this, me being here, this is part of the answer. I felt like the room was tilting. Every rational explanation I tried to construct collapsed under the weight of the details. The purple dress, the sketch that looked like Lily, Chompy. The timing, exactly 3 days after I'd prayed for God to show me more. I stood up, disoriented. I need a minute. Of course. Dr. Harrison, I know this is overwhelming. Take all the time you need. I walked out of the conference room and found an empty office. I called Rachel. Robert, what's wrong? A woman just came to my lab. She says she had a vision of Lily 3 nights ago. She described her perfectly, drew a sketch, knew about the purple dress. Knew about Chompy. Rachel, she knew things she couldn't possibly know. Rachel was quiet for a long moment. God's showing you. You asked him to show you where Lily is, and he's showing you. But this is impossible. Visions aren't real. They're hallucinations, psychological phenomena. Robert, stop, just for a moment. Stop analyzing and just listen. You ask God for evidence. He's giving it to you. The question is, are you going to accept it, or are you going to keep explaining it away? She was right. I'd asked for evidence. I'd said I was willing to be open, and now, when presented with something that defied every natural explanation I could conceive, I was retreating into skepticism. What do I do? Talk to her. Listen to everything Lily told her, and then decide if you're really willing to believe what you said you wanted to believe. I went back to the conference room. Margaret was still there, waiting patiently. Tell me everything, I said. Every detail of what you saw and what Lily said. Margaret spoke for 30 minutes. She described the vision in vivid detail, not just seeing Lily, but experiencing a sense of overwhelming love and peace. She described Lily talking about Jesus like he was a friend she'd just met, about colors that didn't exist on earth, about her grandmother, my mother, who died when I was 20, teaching her things. She said your mother told her all about you as a little boy, Margaret said. About how curious you were, how you always wanted to know how things worked. She said your mother is proud of you and has been praying for you for years. My mother. I'd been an atheist long before she died, and it had broken her heart. She'd prayed for me constantly, begged me to reconsider my rejection of faith, and I'd been so certain I was right, so confident in my materialism, that I dismissed her concerns as the wishful thinking of someone who couldn't face mortality. Lily said she wanted me to tell you specific things so you'd know this was real, Margaret continued. She said to tell you that the last thing she saw before she died was Jesus reaching for her. That's why she said pretty, because his face was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen. She said she wasn't scared because he was there, and she knew immediately that he loved her. I was crying now, full body-shaking sobs, because that explained everything. The peace on Lily's face in those final moments, the word pretty, the sense I'd had that she was seeing something I couldn't. She'd been seeing Jesus. She also wanted me to tell you that death didn't hurt. That one moment she was in her body feeling sick, and the next moment she was free. She said it was like taking off tight shoes after a long day, just relief and freedom. She said she knows you've been torturing yourself thinking about whether she suffered, and she needs you to know she didn't. It was just a transition, like walking through a door from one room into another. Is she happy? Margaret smiled through her own tears. She's more than happy. She's completely joyful. She said there's no sickness here, no pain, no fear, just love and light and more beauty than she can describe. She said she misses you and her mom, but she's not sad because she knows you'll be together again. She said time is different here, that for her it'll feel like no time at all before you're reunited. I couldn't speak, couldn't process. Couldn't do anything but cry and try to breathe through the overwhelming flood of emotions. Dr. Harrison, she gave me one more message. She said to tell you that it's okay to believe now, that God has given you all the proof you asked for, that your scientific mind wants to explain this away, but you know, deep down you know, that this is real. She said to stop being afraid of losing your identity as a scientist and embrace your identity as God's child. She said both can be true, that God gave you your brilliant mind, and He's not asking you to stop using it. He's just asking you to expand what you're willing to see. I sat there for a long time, silent. Margaret waited patiently, not pushing, not adding anything, just giving me space to grapple with what she'd told me. Finally, I spoke. I've spent my entire adult life believing that consciousness is nothing more than brain activity. That when the brain dies, the person ceases to exist, that there's no soul, no afterlife, no God. It's been the foundation of my career, my research, my understanding of reality. And now a woman I've never met has come to my workplace and described my daughter, who's been dead for 2 weeks, in perfect detail, has told me things she couldn't possibly know, has delivered messages that answer questions I've been asking in private, and I can't explain it. I can't rationalize it. I can't make it fit into my materialist worldview. What does that mean? It means, I took a shaky breath, it means I was wrong about everything, about the nature of consciousness, about death, about God, about Lily. I was so certain I had it figured out, so confident that my scientific understanding was complete. But I was missing the most important truth of all, that we're more than just biology, that consciousness continues beyond the brain, that Lily still exists, that God is real. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She'll be so happy you believe now. She was worried you'd try to explain this away. I almost did. I wanted to, but there's no explanation that accounts for what you've told me. No psychological mechanism or neurological phenomenon that would give you accurate information about my daughter that you couldn't have accessed by any normal means. This is, I searched for the word, this is supernatural, divine, God answering my prayer. It is. And Dr. Harrison, this changes everything for you, doesn't it? Everything, because if Lily still exists, if she's conscious and aware and experiencing joy in heaven, then everything I've believed about death is wrong. Everything I've taught about consciousness is incomplete. Everything I've built my career on needs to be reconsidered in light of this reality. That's terrifying. It is. But it's also freeing, because it means Lily's death wasn't the end. It means she's not gone, just changed. It means I'll see her again, And that hope, that certainty, is worth more than any scientific theory I've ever held. Margaret smiled. Lily said you'd get there. She said her daddy was brilliant, and once you saw the evidence, you wouldn't be able to deny it. She knows me well, even from heaven, apparently. We talked for another hour. Margaret shared more details from the vision, and I asked every question I could think of, partly to gather more information, partly to test whether her story would remain consistent. It did. Every detail aligned. Every answer she gave matched what I knew about Lily, about our family, about the circumstances of her death. When Margaret finally left, I sat alone in the conference room for a long time. Then I called Rachel. "Honey, you need to come to the hospital. Something happened, something impossible, something that changes everything. Are you okay?" "More than okay, Rachel, I believe. God showed me. He really showed me. Lily's alive. She's in heaven. She's okay. And I believe it. Not because I want to, but because I can't deny the evidence anymore." Rachel started crying. "Robert, are you sure?" "I'm sure. Come to the hospital. I'll tell you everything. But Rachel, our daughter is alive. Different, but alive. And someday, we're going to see her again." When Rachel arrived, I told her everything Margaret had shared. We cried together, not tears of grief this time, but tears of overwhelming relief and joy and hope. That night, I went into Lily's room again. But this time, I didn't go with grief and despair. I went with certainty. "Lily, I know you can hear me. I know you're alive. I know you're with Jesus. And I believe it now. Really believe it. Thank you for the message. Thank you for not giving up on your stubborn daddy. I love you, and I'll see you again someday." I felt the presence again, that warmth, that sense of not being alone. But this time, I didn't try to explain it. I just accepted it as what it was. God present with me in my daughter's room, comforting me, confirming that everything Margaret had said was true. I knelt beside Lily's bed and prayed, really prayed. Not the desperate, half-believing prayers I'd offered before, but prayers of gratitude and surrender. "God, I was wrong about everything. I'm sorry it took losing my daughter to open my eyes. I'm sorry for decades of arrogance and certainty about things I didn't understand. Thank you for not giving up on me. Thank you for showing me the truth. Thank you for Lily. Thank you for letting her live on. And thank you for loving me enough to answer my prayer." For the first time since Lily had died, I felt peace, not the absence of pain. The grief was still there, still heavy, but peace underneath it. The peace of knowing she was okay, that death wasn't the end, that God was real and loving and had heard my desperate prayers. The atheist neuroscientist who'd been certain he had reality figured out had been wrong, and being wrong had never felt so much like coming home. The days after Margaret's visit were unlike anything I'd experienced. Not easier. The grief was still crushing, still present every moment, but different, because now I grieved with hope instead of despair, with certainty instead of emptiness. Lily wasn't gone. She was alive. Different, but alive. And that changed everything. Rachel and I spent hours talking about Margaret's visit, going over every detail, marveling at how God had answered my desperate prayer in such an undeniable way. "I still can't believe she knew about Chompy," I kept saying. "There's no rational explanation for that. None." "That's the point," Rachel said gently. "God gave you proof that couldn't be explained away. Because He knows you, Robert. He knows you needed evidence your scientific mind couldn't dismiss." She was right. God had met me where I was, a skeptical scientist who needed more than feelings or faith. He'd given me specific, verifiable details that defied natural explanation. He'd shown me my daughter was alive in the only way I could accept, through evidence. But accepting that evidence meant confronting something enormous. I'd been wrong about the fundamental nature of reality. And if I was wrong about that, what did it mean for my career, my research, everything I'd published and taught about consciousness? I called my department head, Dr. James Patterson, and asked to meet with him. "Robert, how are you holding up?" he asked when I came to his office. Better than I was, but I need to talk to you about something. Something that's going to sound unusual. I told him about Margaret's visit, about the vision, about the details she couldn't have known, about my conclusion that consciousness continues beyond brain death. James listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Robert, I'm going to be honest with you. If anyone else told me this story, I'd assume they were having a grief-induced psychotic break, but I've known you for 15 years. You're the most rigorously skeptical scientist I know. If you're saying this experience was real, that it defied natural explanation, I have to take that seriously. I'm not asking you to believe what I believe. I'm just telling you that I can't continue my research on consciousness the same way I did before, because I now know that consciousness isn't purely an emergent property of brain activity. There's something more, something that continues beyond the death of the brain. What are you saying, that you're abandoning your research? No, but I'm expanding it. I want to study near-death experiences, terminal lucidity, cases of consciousness appearing to continue beyond clinical death, not to debunk them like I would have before, but to seriously investigate whether they provide evidence for consciousness beyond the brain. James leaned back in his chair. You realize how controversial this will be? Your colleagues will think you've lost your objectivity. That grief has compromised your scientific judgment. I know. But James, what if we've been approaching consciousness research with a materialist bias that's prevented us from seeing the full picture? What if consciousness is more than just neurons firing? What if there's a component that's non-physical, that continues after the brain dies? Shouldn't we at least investigate that possibility with the same rigor we apply to materialist theories? It's not that simple, Robert. The moment you suggest consciousness might be non-physical, you're crossing from science into religion. You'll lose credibility. What if the line between science and religion has been artificially rigid? What if both are trying to understand the same reality from different angles? James, I'm not suggesting we abandon the scientific method. I'm suggesting we apply it more broadly, that we don't dismiss evidence just because it doesn't fit our materialist assumptions. James sighed. I can't stop you from pursuing this research, but I need to warn you, it's going to cost you. Grants will be harder to get. Papers will be harder to publish. Colleagues will question your judgment. Are you prepared for that? I am, because I've seen something that can't be explained by our current models. And as a scientist, my job is to follow the evidence wherever it leads, even if it leads somewhere uncomfortable. Over the next weeks, I began a different kind of research. I read everything I could find on near-death experiences, not the skeptical debunking papers I'd read before, but the actual case studies, and I was shocked by what I found. There were documented cases of people accurately describing events that occurred while they were clinically dead, blind people describing visual details from their out-of-body experiences, children too young to have cultural conditioning describing experiences similar to adults across cultures. I dismissed all of it before as anecdotal, unreliable, contaminated by belief, but reading it now with an open mind, I saw patterns I'd ignored, consistency across cultures and backgrounds, specific verifiable details that couldn't easily be explained by hallucination or prior knowledge. I started reaching out to researchers who studied these phenomena, people I'd previously dismissed as fringe scientists. And I found many of them were rigorous, credible researchers who'd followed the evidence to conclusions that challenged materialist orthodoxy. One researcher, Dr. Peter Fenwick, a neuropsychiatrist in the UK, agreed to talk with me. Dr. Harrison, I'm familiar with your work on consciousness, he said during our video call. You've been a vocal proponent of the idea that consciousness is purely physical. What changed? I told him about Lily, about her death, about Margaret's vision, about the details that couldn't be explained. I'm sorry for your loss, he said, but I'm not surprised by your experience. I've been researching end-of-life phenomena for 30 years, and I've encountered hundreds of cases that suggest consciousness continues beyond brain death. The evidence is there. It's just been systematically ignored because it doesn't fit the prevailing paradigm. Didi, why has it been ignored? Because accepting it requires admitting we don't understand consciousness as well as we thought we did. It requires acknowledging that materialism might be incomplete as an explanatory framework. And for many scientists, that's too threatening. It undermines their entire worldview. That's exactly where I was. My entire identity was built on materialist certainty. And now? Now I know there's more. I've seen it. Or rather, I've encountered evidence for it that I can't explain away, and I want to study it seriously. Not to prove my religious beliefs, but to understand the actual nature of consciousness, wherever that investigation leads. Dr. Fenwick smiled. Welcome to a very small, very controversial club. But Robert, I need to warn you, this work will change you. Not just professionally, but personally. You can't study consciousness beyond the brain without confronting questions about meaning, purpose, God. Are you ready for that? I don't think I have a choice. My daughter's death and what followed, it's already changed me. I can't go back to pretending I have it all figured out. Around this time, Rachel suggested I talk to Pastor David at the church. Why? I asked. Because you're trying to integrate your scientific understanding with your new faith, and you're doing it alone. Pastor David has a PhD in theology. He might be able to help you think through these questions. So I made an appointment to meet with him at his office at the church. Robert, I'm so glad you came, he said, shaking my hand. Rachel told me about what happened with Margaret. That must have been profound. It was. It shattered everything I thought I knew about reality. Tell me about that. For the next hour, I talked about my struggle, about being a scientist who now believed in God, but didn't know how to reconcile that with my research. About wanting to maintain intellectual integrity while acknowledging truths that went beyond what science could measure. Pastor David listened carefully. When I finished, he said something that surprised me. Robert, you're asking the right questions, but I think you're operating under a false assumption that faith and reason are opposites. They're not. Faith is trust based on good reasons, and reason, when properly applied, can point toward God. But science requires naturalistic explanations. The moment I invoke God, I've left science behind. Have you? Or have you just acknowledged the limits of scientific methodology? Science is excellent at studying the physical world, but consciousness, especially consciousness that continues beyond the brain, might be a phenomenon that has both physical and non-physical aspects. Science can study the physical aspects, but it might need to acknowledge there are non-physical aspects it can't directly measure. That's what I've been thinking, but my colleagues would say I'm abandoning scientific rigor. Are you? You're still using evidence. You're still reasoning carefully. You're still testing claims. You've just expanded what you're willing to consider as evidence. That's not abandoning science. That's following it honestly. But how do I know when I'm following evidence and when I'm just seeing what I want to see because of grief? Pastor David leaned forward. That's the right question to ask. And here's my answer. Test everything. Be as rigorous about your spiritual experiences as you are about your scientific research. Look for consistency. Look for coherence with other evidence. Be willing to be wrong, but also be willing to follow the truth, even when it's uncomfortable. That's what led me here. Following the truth about Margaret's vision led me to conclude that consciousness continues beyond death, which led me to God. And has that conclusion been consistent with other evidence? Has it held up under scrutiny? I thought about it. The dream I'd had of Lily, the presence I'd felt in her room, the peace Rachel had found through faith, the consistency of near-death experiences across cultures, the fact that many credible scientists had followed similar evidence to similar conclusions. Yes, it's held up. Everything I've learned since Margaret's visit has been consistent with the conclusion that consciousness continues. that God is real, that Lily is alive in heaven, then you're not abandoning reason. You're following it. You're just following it somewhere you didn't expect it to lead. That conversation helped more than I could express, because I'd been afraid that accepting God meant abandoning my identity as a scientist. But Pastor David helped me see that I could be both, a rigorous scientist and a person of faith, that both were searching for truth, just from different angles. I started attending church regularly with Rachel, and I was surprised by how much I enjoyed it. The worship still felt foreign. I didn't know the songs, didn't feel comfortable raising my hands like others did, but the teaching engaged my mind. The community provided support, and the sense of God's presence I'd felt in Lily's room was there too, especially during moments of prayer. One Sunday, Pastor David preached on doubt and faith. He talked about Thomas, the disciple who wouldn't believe Jesus had risen unless he could see and touch the wounds. Jesus didn't condemn Thomas for his doubt, Pastor David said. He met Thomas where he was. He provided the evidence Thomas needed. And then he said, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." But notice, he still gave Thomas what he needed. God doesn't despise our need for evidence. He knows how he made us. Some of us need to see before we can believe. I felt tears on my face, because that's exactly what God had done for me. He'd known I needed evidence, known I couldn't believe based on feelings or tradition or what others told me. So he'd given me Margaret's vision, specific, undeniable evidence that Lily was alive and that God was real. After the service, I approached Pastor David. "Thank you for that sermon. It was exactly what I needed to hear. God knows what each of us needs. You needed evidence. He gave it to you. But Robert, now that you have that evidence, what are you going to do with it? What do you mean? You've encountered God. You know Lily is alive in heaven. You've been given proof that consciousness continues beyond death. That's not just personal comfort. That's knowledge that could help others. Other grieving parents, other skeptics, other scientists who've been taught to dismiss anything that doesn't fit materialist assumptions. What are you going to do with what you've learned?" His question stayed with me for days. What was I going to do with this knowledge? I decided to start writing, not a research paper, not yet, but a personal account. I wrote about Lily's death, about my atheism and certainty, about the dream, about Margaret's visit, about how God had shown me that my daughter was alive. I didn't know what I'd do with it, but I needed to get it down on paper, to process it, to have a record of what had happened before time and doubt could blur the details. Rachel found me writing late one night. "What are you working on?" "I'm writing about what happened, about Lily, about Margaret, about how I went from certain atheist to believing in God and heaven." "Are you going to share it?" "I don't know. Part of me wants to tell other people who've lost children that death isn't the end, that there's hope. But another part of me is terrified of how my colleagues will react." "Robert, you're not responsible for how people react to the truth. You're only responsible for telling it." She was right. I'd encountered something real, something that had changed everything for me. And whether others believed it or not, I had an obligation to share it honestly. A few days later, I got an email from Margaret Chen. She asked if we could meet for coffee. We met at a cafe near the hospital. "How are you doing?" she asked. "Better, still grieving, but different now, with hope instead of despair." "I'm glad. Robert, I wanted to tell you, since I delivered Lily's message to you, I've had 3 more visions, different people, different messages. God is using me to communicate with grieving families, to let them know their loved ones are okay." "That's amazing." "It is, but it's also overwhelming. I'm a nurse. I'm trained in science and medicine, and now I'm having visions of dead people who give me messages for their families. It's not something I ever expected or wanted." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you understand. You're a scientist who's encountered something that doesn't fit the scientific framework you were trained in. And you've had to decide whether to dismiss it or accept it and deal with the consequences. I'm facing the same choice. What are you going to do?" "I'm going to keep delivering the messages. because I've seen the impact it had on you, the hope it gave you. And I think God is using this gift, strange as it is, to bring comfort to people who are suffering. But I wanted to ask you, how are you reconciling this with your scientific training? By expanding my understanding of what science can and can't explain, I still believe in evidence, reason, rigorous investigation. But I now accept that there are realities beyond what physical science can directly measure. That doesn't make them less real. It just means we need different tools to study them. Margaret smiled. That's helpful. Thank you. As we parted, I felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not just for Margaret's role in showing me that Lily was alive, but for the reminder that I wasn't alone in navigating this intersection of science and faith. That night I prayed with more confidence than I'd had since my conversion. God, thank you for meeting me where I was, for knowing I needed evidence and providing it, for showing me that Lily is alive and okay, for helping me see that faith and reason aren't enemies. I don't know what comes next. I don't know how to be a scientist who believes in you without compromising either my science or my faith, but I'm willing to figure it out. I'm willing to follow wherever this leads. Use what I've learned, use my story, use my scientific training and my newfound faith. However you want, I'm yours now, finally, completely yours. And thank you for Lily, for the 5 years I got to be her father, for the assurance that I'll see her again, for using her death, as terrible as it was, to bring me to you. I miss her every day. The grief hasn't gone away, but it's different now. It's grief mixed with hope, pain mixed with certainty, loss mixed with the knowledge that it's only temporary. She's alive, she's with you, she's more than okay, she's joyful and free and whole. And someday I'll hold her again, not the sick, dying version, but the radiant, healed version she is now. Thank you for that hope. Thank you for that certainty. Thank you for showing me where she is. I believe now, really, truly believe, and I'm never going back to the empty certainty I had before, because I've seen the truth, and the truth has set me free. 5 weeks after Lily's death, I had become someone unrecognizable from who I'd been, not the certain atheist neuroscientist who had everything figured out, but a grieving father, learning to trust a God he'd denied for 42 years, a scientist reconsidering everything he'd believed about consciousness, a husband finding new connection with his wife through shared faith, a man who'd lost his daughter, but gained the certainty that death wasn't the end. The journey was far from over, but I was walking it differently now, not alone in my certainty, but accompanied by hope, not ending in despair, but continuing toward reunion. And that made all the difference. 2 months after Lily's death, I did something that would have been unthinkable to the old me. I shared my story publicly for the first time. It started small. A grief support group at the church had invited me to speak. Just 15 people, other parents who'd lost children. Rachel encouraged me to do it. They need to hear this, she said. They need to know their children are okay, that death isn't the end. I was terrified. Not of public speaking. I'd given countless academic presentations, but of being vulnerable, of sharing something so personal, so profound with strangers, of risking their judgment, their skepticism, their potential dismissal. But I thought about what Pastor David had said. What are you going to do with what you've learned? So I went. The meeting was in a small room at the church. 15 parents, all carrying the unbearable weight of losing a child. Some losses were recent like mine. Others were years old but still raw. I could see it in their faces, the same emptiness I'd felt before Margaret's visit. I introduced myself. My name is Robert. I'm a neuroscientist. 2 months ago, my 5-year-old daughter Lily died of brain cancer, and I was an atheist who believed death was the absolute end. That when the brain stopped, the person ceased to exist, that there was no heaven, no God, no continuation of consciousness. I saw recognition in some faces, the same materialist certainty I'd held. But I was wrong, and I know I was wrong, because God showed me, not through feelings or faith, but through evidence I couldn't deny. For the next 30 minutes I told them everything. Lily's death, The dream, Margaret's vision, the specific details she couldn't have known. The conclusion I couldn't escape. Lily was alive, conscious, joyful, in heaven with Jesus. When I finished, the room was silent. Then a woman started crying. Not sad tears, but something else. "My son died 3 years ago," she said. "And everyone tells me he's in a better place, but I never believed it. I thought they were just saying it to make me feel better. But you're a scientist. You believed death was the end. And you changed your mind because of evidence. That gives me hope. Real hope. Not just wishful thinking, but actual hope that my son is okay." Others shared similar responses. A father whose daughter had died in a car accident. A mother whose infant had died of SIDS. They'd been told about heaven, but they'd struggled to believe it. And hearing my story, hearing that a skeptical scientist had encountered proof that consciousness continues, it gave them permission to hope. But not everyone reacted positively. One man, probably in his 40s, spoke up angrily. "This is exactly what I can't stand about religious people. You take grief and twist it into proof of God. You had a dream, and someone who probably researched your daughter online told you what you wanted to hear, and now you're calling it divine revelation. It's not evidence, it's delusion." I recognize myself in his anger, the defensive skepticism, the need to explain away anything that challenged his worldview. "I understand your reaction," I said calmly. "I would have said the exact same thing 2 months ago, but I've examined this from every angle. I've tried to find natural explanations, and they don't hold up. The details Margaret knew, they weren't public information. Chompy was never mentioned in any obituary or online. The timing of her vision, exactly when I prayed for God to show me more, that's not coincidence. It could be. Unlikely coincidences happen all the time. They do. But when multiple unlikely coincidences align perfectly to answer a specific prayer, at some point, the simplest explanation is that it's not coincidence. It's an answer." The man shook his head, unconvinced. But I saw others nodding. Not because I'd proven anything to them, but because my story resonated with something they'd experienced. Dreams of their children, sense of presence, small moments that felt like more than coincidence. After the meeting, several parents approached me privately. They shared their own experiences, things they'd been afraid to mention because they thought people would think they were crazy. A mother who'd smelled her daughter's perfume in an empty room. A father who'd heard his son's laugh when no one was there. A couple who'd both dreamed of their child on the same night, receiving the same message. "I thought I was making it up," one mother said. "Grief hallucinations, but hearing your story, maybe it was real. Maybe she was really there." "I can't tell you for certain," I said, "but I can tell you this. I've learned to take these experiences seriously, to consider that they might be exactly what they seem, communication from our children who are still alive, just in a different place." Driving home, I felt drained, but also purposeful. Sharing my story had been hard, but it had helped people, given them hope, permission to believe that death wasn't the end. Rachel noticed the change in me when I got home. "How did it go?" "Hard, but good. I think people needed to hear it, and I think I needed to tell it. You're finding your purpose in this, aren't you? Using what God showed you to help others." She was right. For 2 months, I'd been focused on my own grief, my own transformation, my own struggle to reconcile faith and science. But sharing my story had shown me there was a bigger purpose, helping others who were drowning in the same despair I'd felt. The next week, I got an email from a woman who'd been at the grief group. She'd told her pastor about my story, and he wanted to know if I'd be willing to speak at their church. "It's a larger congregation," she wrote, "about 500 people. I know that's a lot, but our pastor thinks your story could really help people who are struggling with doubt, who need to hear that faith can coexist with intellectual rigor." 500 people. That was different from 15. That was public in a way that terrified me, but I also felt God's gentle nudge. "This is why I showed you. Not just for you, but for everyone who needs to know death isn't the end." So I said yes. The church was in a suburb of Boston, Contemporary worship, diverse congregation, packed sanctuary. I sat in the front row with Rachel, my heart pounding. Pastor Mike, who'd invited me, introduced me. Today we have a special guest. Dr. Robert Harrison is a neuroscientist who spent most of his life as an atheist. 2 months ago, his daughter died, and what happened next changed everything he believed about God, death, and consciousness. I've asked him to share his story with us. I stood at the pulpit, looking out at 500 faces, and felt completely inadequate. What was I doing? I wasn't a preacher. I wasn't even comfortable with Christianity yet. I was a scientist who'd been a believer for all of 2 months. But then I remembered Margaret's words. She wanted you to know she's more alive now than she ever was before. And I knew why I was there. To tell people what God had shown me. I don't have a sermon prepared, I began. I'm not a theologian or a pastor. I'm a neuroscientist. And until 2 months ago, I was absolutely certain that when you die, you cease to exist. That consciousness is just brain activity. That heaven is a comforting myth. I was wrong about all of it. I told the whole story again. But this time I went deeper. I talked about the arrogance of my atheism, the false certainty that I had reality figured out, the emptiness of believing death was the end, the crushing grief of holding my dying daughter while believing she was about to simply stop existing, and then the dream, Margaret's vision, the undeniable evidence, the transformation from certainty to faith. I stand before you today as someone who's had to completely rebuild my understanding of reality, I said. Everything I built my career on, materialist neuroscience, the belief that consciousness is purely physical, I had to reconsider all of it in light of what God showed me, and it's been humbling, terrifying, but also freeing, because I know now that Lily didn't cease to exist. She's more alive than ever, and that changes everything. It changes how I grieve, with hope instead of despair. It changes how I see death, not as an ending, but as a transition. It changes how I understand consciousness, not as just brain activity, but as something that continues beyond the brain. And it changes how I see God, not as a myth, but as the most real thing there is. I paused, looking out at the faces watching me. Some of you have lost someone you love, and you've been told they're in heaven, but you haven't been able to fully believe it. You've wanted to, but you couldn't get past the doubt. I'm here to tell you, as someone who was the biggest skeptic you'd ever meet, that it's true. Death isn't the end. Your loved one still exists. They're conscious, aware, experiencing joy beyond anything we can imagine here, and you will see them again. I saw people crying throughout the sanctuary, but these weren't tears of despair. They were tears of hope, of relief, of finally allowing themselves to believe what they desperately wanted to believe. After the service, the line of people wanting to talk with me stretched across the sanctuary. One after another, they shared their stories, their doubts, their losses, their desperate need for the hope I'd offered. A woman whose husband had died suddenly. I've been so angry at God for taking him, but hearing your story, maybe God didn't take him away. Maybe he just brought him home. A teenager whose best friend had committed suicide. I was told she couldn't be in heaven because of how she died, but you're saying consciousness continues no matter how someone dies. I can't speak to all the theological questions, I admitted, but I can tell you what God showed me, that Lily is alive and joyful and loved by Jesus. If God can do that for my daughter, I believe he can do it for anyone who dies. His love and mercy are bigger than our theological categories. An elderly man whose wife had died 5 years ago. I've missed her every day, and I've wanted to believe I'd see her again, but I'm a retired engineer. I needed logic, not just faith. Your story, it gives me both. Thank you. The conversations went on for hours. Rachel stood beside me, occasionally interjecting her own perspective as a lifelong Christian who'd found her faith deepened through this experience. Finally, Pastor Mike approached. Robert, this has been powerful. Would you be willing to do this again? We have a network of churches in the region. I think your story could really help a lot of people. I I don't know. I'm not a professional speaker. I'm a scientist who's still figuring out what it means to be a Christian. That's exactly why people connect with your story. You're not pretending to have it all figured out. You're sharing what you've experienced honestly. That authenticity is more powerful than any polished sermon. I looked at Rachel. She nodded encouragingly. Okay, I said, I'll do it. But I need to make something clear. I'm not abandoning my work as a scientist. I'm trying to integrate my faith with my research. So any speaking I do has to work around my work schedule. Of course. We'll work with whatever availability you have. Driving home that night, I was exhausted, but also energized. Did you see their faces? I asked Rachel. When I talked about Lily being alive, they needed to hear that so badly. You're becoming an evangelist, Rachel said with a smile. My atheist husband is becoming an evangelist. I'm not. I'm just sharing what happened. That's what evangelism is, sharing the good news. And Robert, the news that death isn't the end, that our loved ones are alive and joyful and we'll see them again. That's the best news possible for people who are grieving. Over the next month, I spoke at 6 different churches. Each time the response was the same. People desperately needing hope, finding it in the story of a skeptical scientist who'd encountered proof that consciousness continues beyond death. But the speaking also created tension. My colleagues at the hospital had heard about it, and the reactions were mixed. Dr. Patterson called me into his office. Robert, I'm hearing that you're speaking at churches about religious experiences. Is that true? It is. I'm sharing what happened after Lily died, about the evidence I encountered that consciousness continues beyond the brain. You realize this is affecting how people view your professional credibility. There are researchers who won't collaborate with you now because they think you've abandoned scientific objectivity. I haven't abandoned objectivity. I've just expanded what I'm willing to consider as evidence. Robert, I say this as a friend. Be careful. You're building a reputation as someone who's let grief compromise his judgment. That's going to make it very difficult to continue your research career. His warning stung, because I knew he was right. In the scientific community, suggesting that consciousness might continue beyond the brain was professional suicide. No matter how carefully I framed it, no matter how much evidence I presented, many of my colleagues would see it as a scientist gone off the deep end. But I also knew I couldn't stay silent, not when I'd been given such clear evidence. Not when sharing it was helping so many people. That night, I prayed about it. God, I'm at a crossroads. I can protect my career by staying quiet about what you showed me, or I can keep sharing it and accept the professional consequences. I don't know what to do. As I prayed, I felt that now familiar presence, and a thought that wasn't quite mine. Which matters more, what your colleagues think of you or what I'm calling you to do? The answer was obvious. God had shown me something extraordinary. He'd answered my desperate prayer in the most undeniable way. And now he was asking me to share that with others, regardless of the professional cost. I couldn't say no to that, even if it meant my career as a neuroscientist was effectively over. Rachel found me in Lily's room, where I still went when I needed to think and pray. What are you wrestling with? She asked. The cost of sharing my story. Doctor, Patterson warned me today that it's damaging my professional reputation, that colleagues won't work with me anymore because they think I've lost objectivity. And I think he's right. I think my career as a traditional neuroscientist is probably over, but I also know I can't stop sharing what God showed me. Too many people need to hear it. Rachel sat beside me on Lily's bed. Do you remember what Lily said in Margaret's vision? That you had important work to do? Maybe this is the work. Not traditional neuroscience, but helping grieving people understand that death isn't the end, using your scientific credibility to give people permission to believe. That's a big shift from the career I planned. God has a way of disrupting our plans, but his plans are always better. Look at what's happened in 2 months. Hundreds of people have found hope through your story. How many people did your neuroscience research help? She had a point. My research had contributed to the field, but it had been abstract, theoretical. This, sharing my story, giving people hope, was directly helping people in their darkest moments. "You're right," I said. "I think God is redirecting my career, not away from science entirely, but toward using my scientific background to help people understand that faith and reason aren't enemies. That evidence for consciousness beyond the brain exists, if we're willing to look at it honestly. Then do that, and trust that God will provide whatever you need to do it." That night, I made a decision. I would continue my research, but I would shift its focus entirely. Instead of trying to reduce consciousness to purely physical processes, I would investigate evidence for consciousness beyond the brain, near-death experiences, terminal lucidity, deathbed visions, all the phenomena I'd previously dismissed, and I would keep sharing my story. Not as a preacher or evangelist, but as a scientist who'd encountered evidence he couldn't deny. Someone who could give people rational reasons to believe their loved ones still existed beyond death. It wouldn't be the career I'd planned, but it would be the career God was calling me to. And after everything he'd shown me, how could I say no? I prayed with gratitude and surrender. "God, I'm letting go of the career I planned and accepting the one you're giving me. Use me however you want. Use my story, my training, my experience, all of it, for your purposes. Thank you for showing me that Lily is alive. Thank you for using her death to transform my life and help others. Thank you for giving me new purpose in the midst of grief. I don't know where this path leads, but I trust you're already there. And that's enough." 2 months after Lily's death, I had become someone completely different from who I'd been, not just in what I believed, but in what I was becoming. A scientist who'd encountered God, a skeptic transformed by evidence, a grieving father helping others find hope. The journey was far from over, but I was walking it with purpose now, with faith, with hope, with certainty that death wasn't the end, and with gratitude for a God who'd loved me enough to show me where my daughter was. 3 months after Lily's death, something unexpected happened. I received an invitation to speak at a conference on consciousness studies at MIT, my own field, addressing my former colleagues. The invitation came from Dr. Susan Chen, a researcher I'd collaborated with years ago. Her email was cautious but intrigued. "Robert, I've heard about what you've been experiencing since your daughter's death. I know you've been speaking at churches about consciousness continuing beyond the brain. I also know this has made you controversial in our field, but I think you have something important to contribute to the conversation about consciousness. Would you be willing to present at our conference, not to preach, but to share your perspective as a neuroscientist who's encountered evidence that challenges materialist assumptions?" I stared at the email for a long time. This was different from speaking at churches. This would be presenting to scientists, people trained in skepticism, committed to naturalistic explanations, many of whom would view my new beliefs as a betrayal of scientific principles. "I don't know if I should do this," I told Rachel that evening. "Why not?" "Because they're going to tear me apart. Present evidence for consciousness beyond the brain to a room full of materialist neuroscientists. I might as well stand up and say I believe in fairy tales. Or you might give some of them permission to look at evidence they've been dismissing. Robert, you said God is redirecting your career. Maybe this is part of it, using your scientific credibility, whatever remains of it, to open doors in places where faith isn't usually welcome." She had a point, so I accepted the invitation. The conference was titled, "The Hard Problem of Consciousness, New Perspectives." My session was called Evidence for Consciousness Beyond the Brain, a Neuroscientist's Journey. The room held about 80 researchers. I recognized many of them, colleagues I'd published with, debated with, collaborated with over the years. They looked at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern, like they were watching someone they'd respected have a public breakdown. I stood at the podium and decided to be completely honest. 3 months ago, I would have been in this audience, listening skeptically to anyone suggesting consciousness might continue beyond the brain. I spent my career arguing that consciousness is an emergent property of neural activity, nothing more. I dismissed near-death experiences as hallucinations, deathbed visions as neurological phenomena, and any suggestion of an afterlife as wishful thinking. Then my 5-year-old daughter died, and what happened in the weeks following her death forced me to reconsider everything I'd believed about consciousness. I told them the story, not in the emotional, personal way I told it at churches, but in clinical, scientific terms. I described the dream with specific details. I explained Margaret's vision, emphasizing the information she conveyed that wasn't publicly available. I outlined the statistical improbability of the coincidences involved. I've spent 3 months trying to explain these experiences naturalistically, I said. I've reviewed the literature on grief hallucinations, REM sleep phenomena, cold reading techniques, confirmation bias. And I have to conclude, as uncomfortable as it makes me, that naturalistic explanations are inadequate. The simplest explanation that accounts for all the data is that my daughter's consciousness continues to exist beyond her brain, and that this continuing consciousness was able to communicate information to someone who had no normal means of accessing it. The room was silent. I could see some colleagues looking uncomfortable, others skeptical. A few seemed genuinely intrigued. "I'm not asking you to believe what I believe," I continued. "I'm asking you to consider whether our field has been operating under an unexamined assumption that consciousness must be purely physical. What if that assumption is wrong? What if consciousness has both physical and non-physical aspects? What if the brain doesn't generate consciousness, but rather mediates or receives it, like a radio receiving a signal rather than creating it? I know this sounds radical. It sounds radical to me, and I'm the one proposing it. But science is supposed to follow evidence wherever it leads, and I've encountered evidence that doesn't fit our current models. The question is, are we willing to examine that evidence honestly, or are we going to dismiss it because it doesn't fit our philosophical commitments? When I finished, the response was immediate and divided. Dr. Michael Torres, a prominent consciousness researcher, spoke first. "Robert, with all respect, what you're describing is exactly what we'd expect from grief-induced cognitive bias. You desperately wanted your daughter to still exist, so your brain created experiences that confirmed that belief. The fact that you've abandoned scientific rigor in favor of supernatural explanations is concerning." "I haven't abandoned scientific rigor," I replied. "I've applied it to experiences I previously would have dismissed without examination. The question is whether you're willing to examine evidence that challenges your worldview, or whether you're going to dismiss it without investigation because it's uncomfortable." Dr. Chen, who'd invited me, spoke next. "I think Robert raises an important point. We pride ourselves on following evidence, but if we're honest, we often interpret evidence through a materialist lens that excludes certain possibilities a priori. Maybe we should at least seriously investigate phenomena that suggest consciousness might not be reducible to brain activity." The debate continued for over an hour. Some colleagues were openly hostile, viewing my presentation as a scientist gone off the rails. Others were cautiously interested, admitting they'd encountered phenomena in their own research that didn't fit neat materialist explanations. But the most impactful moment came from someone I didn't expect. Dr. Patricia Williams, a respected neuroscientist in her 60s who'd been quiet throughout the discussion. "I need to share something I've never shared publicly," she said. 30 years ago, my husband died during surgery. He was clinically dead for 4 minutes before they revived him. And when he woke up, he described events that occurred in the operating room during those 4 minutes, conversations between surgeons, a nurse who left to get equipment, specific details he couldn't have known because he had no brain activity during that time. I've spent 30 years trying to explain that away, telling myself he must have heard things before or after, that his memory was confused, that there had to be a natural explanation. But listening to you, Robert, I have to admit, I've been dismissing evidence because it doesn't fit my worldview. And that's not science, that's ideology masquerading as science. Her admission stunned the room. Dr. Williams was a pillar of the neuroscience community. If she was willing to admit she'd encountered evidence for consciousness beyond the brain, it gave others permission to do the same. After the session, several colleagues approached me privately. They shared experiences they'd never mentioned before. Patients who described events during cardiac arrest, research findings that suggested consciousness might not be purely physical, philosophical questions they'd been afraid to voice. "Thank you for being willing to say this publicly," one researcher told me. "I've been struggling with these questions for years, but was afraid to discuss them because I'd lose credibility. You've opened a door." But not everyone was supportive. As I was leaving, Dr. Torres confronted me in the hallway. "Robert, I say this as someone who respected your work. You're destroying your career. You've let grief compromise your judgment, and now you're spreading that compromised thinking to others. It's irresponsible." "Mike, I've examined this more rigorously than I've examined anything in my career. I've looked for every possible natural explanation. They don't account for the evidence." "Then you're not looking hard enough. There's always a natural explanation. Always. The moment you invoke the supernatural, you've left science behind. What if the supernatural is just a word we use for natural phenomena we don't yet understand? What if consciousness actually does continue beyond the brain, and we've been missing it because we've defined it out of existence with our philosophical commitments?" He shook his head. "I'm disappointed in you, Robert. I really am." He walked away. His words stung. Because part of me agreed with him, the old me, the certain atheist who'd had everything figured out. That version of me would have been appalled by what I was now saying. But I wasn't that person anymore. I'd seen too much, experienced too much, examined too much evidence to go back to comfortable materialism. That evening, I called Margaret Chen. I needed to talk to someone who understood what it was like to encounter something that didn't fit the scientific framework we'd been trained in. "How do you handle the criticism?" I asked her, "when people tell you you're delusional or making it up?" I remind myself that I'm not responsible for making them believe. I'm only responsible for telling the truth about what I've experienced. Some people will accept it, others won't, but that doesn't change what actually happened. It's hard, though. These are colleagues I've worked with for years, people whose respect I valued, and now they think I've lost my mind. "Robert, you had a choice when God showed you that Lily is alive. You could have kept it private, protected your career, maintained your reputation, but you chose to share it, knowing it would cost you professionally. That took courage. Don't doubt that choice now just because it's hard. She was right. I'd made the choice, and I'd make it again, even knowing the cost." Over the next weeks, the fallout from the conference continued. Some colleagues stopped collaborating with me. Grant proposals I submitted were rejected with reviewers citing concerns about my objectivity. Journal articles I'd co-authored years ago were now being re-examined by colleagues questioning whether they could trust my previous work. But there were also unexpected developments. Dr. Williams contacted me about starting a research group focused on evidence for consciousness beyond the brain. Several younger researchers reached out, sharing that my presentation had given them courage to investigate phenomena they'd been afraid to study. And most surprisingly, I received an email from the director of the Division of Perceptual Studies at the University of Virginia, a research unit that had been studying consciousness, near-death experiences, and related phenomena for decades. "Dr. Harrison, I was fascinated by your presentation at MIT. We've been conducting rigorous scientific research on consciousness beyond the brain for over 50 years. Your combination of neuroscience expertise and personal experience with these phenomena could be very valuable to our work. Would you be interested in a visiting researcher position?" I showed the email to Rachel. This could be it, a way to continue scientific research while investigating the very questions I'm now asking. But it would mean leaving my position here, starting over professionally. Is that what you want to do? I thought about it. My current position felt increasingly untenable. I was a neuroscientist who no longer believed consciousness was purely physical, working in a department committed to materialist neuroscience. The tension was constant. I think it might be. This feels like the next step God is opening up. A way to use my training to investigate consciousness beyond the brain with researchers who take the evidence seriously. Then do it. We'll figure out the logistics. But Robert, don't pass up an opportunity to do meaningful work just because it's not the career you originally planned. I accepted the position. And 2 months later, 5 months after Lily's death, I moved to Virginia to begin a new chapter in my career and my life. The work at the Division of Perceptual Studies was unlike anything I'd done before. We investigated near-death experiences with rigorous methodology. We studied cases of young children who claimed to remember past lives, examining whether their claims could be verified. We researched deathbed visions, terminal lucidity, and other phenomena that suggested consciousness might not be limited to brain activity. It was controversial work. Many in the mainstream scientific community viewed it with skepticism or outright dismissal. But it was also some of the most meaningful work I'd ever done. Because unlike my previous research, which had been abstract and theoretical, this work directly addressed the questions that mattered most. What happens when we die? Does consciousness continue? Will we see our loved ones again? And my personal experience with Lily gave me a unique perspective. I wasn't just investigating these questions academically, I was investigating them as someone who'd encountered evidence firsthand. Someone who'd gone from skeptic to believer based on evidence I couldn't dismiss. One of my first projects was documenting my own case, Lily's death, the dream, Margaret's vision. I wrote it up with the same rigor I'd apply to any research case, detailing the evidence, examining alternative explanations, and reaching conclusions based on the data. The paper was titled, Consciousness Beyond Death, a neuroscientist's investigation of veridical information transmitted after clinical death. Oh geez, it was the most personal and most rigorous thing I'd ever written. When it was published in the Journal of Near-Death Studies, the response was predictable. Some colleagues praised it as a courageous examination of phenomena that deserved serious study. Others condemned it as a scientist letting grief cloud his judgment. But what mattered most to me were the emails I received from parents who'd lost children, from people who'd had their own experiences of communication from deceased loved ones, but had been afraid to talk about them, from skeptics who, like me, had encountered evidence they couldn't explain away. "Thank you for sharing this," one father wrote. "My daughter died 2 years ago, and I've had dreams of her that felt different from normal dreams, more real, more vivid, with information I didn't have, but I dismissed them because I didn't think they could be real. Reading your paper, examining how rigorously you approached your experience, it's given me permission to take my own experiences seriously, to believe that maybe she really was communicating with me." Those emails reminded me why I'd been willing to sacrifice my career in conventional neuroscience, because this work, helping people understand that death isn't the end, that consciousness continues, that they'll see their loved ones again, this mattered in a way my previous research never had. 6 months after Lily's death, I stood in front of a support group for bereaved parents in Virginia. It was similar to the first group I'd spoken to in Boston, but now I had more to share. Not just my initial experience, but 6 months of research, investigation, and growing certainty. When my daughter died, I told them, I believed death was the absolute end. And that belief made my grief unbearable. But God showed me I was wrong. And now, 6 months later, I can tell you with even greater certainty, your children are alive. Not in the way they were here, but truly, fully alive, conscious, aware, joyful, and you will see them again. A mother raised her hand. How can you be so certain? How do you know it's not just what you want to believe? Because I've spent 6 months investigating it with the same rigor I applied to my neuroscience research. I've examined hundreds of cases of near-death experiences, deathbed visions, cases of apparent communication from the deceased, and the evidence consistently points in one direction. Consciousness continues beyond the death of the brain. Not because I want it to be true, but because that's what the evidence shows when you examine it honestly. But what about science? Doesn't science say consciousness is just brain activity? Some scientists say that. But an increasing number of researchers are concluding that consciousness might not be reducible to brain activity alone, that the brain might be more like a receiver than a generator. And the evidence from my own experience and from hundreds of similar cases supports that conclusion. After the meeting, the mother who'd asked the question approached me. "My son died 4 months ago, and I've been so angry at God for taking him. But hearing you, a scientist, someone who didn't even believe in God, say with such certainty that he's alive, it's the first real hope I've had since he died." Driving home that night, I reflected on how far I'd come in 6 months, from atheist neuroscientist to researcher investigating consciousness beyond the brain, from someone who believed death was the end to someone who knew with certainty it was a transition, from desperate grief to grief mixed with hope and purpose. I called Rachel, who'd stayed in Boston to finish some work before joining me in Virginia. "How was the group?" she asked. "Good. Hard, but good. I love this work, Rachel. Helping people find hope. Showing them that death isn't the end. You've found your calling. Using what God showed you to help others. I'm proud of you. I miss Lily every day. The grief hasn't gone away. I know. I miss her too. But we're living differently now, aren't we? We're grieving with hope instead of despair. With certainty instead of emptiness. We are, and that makes all the difference." That night, I prayed with gratitude for 6 months of transformation. God, thank you for meeting me in my darkest moment. Thank you for showing me that Lily is alive. Thank you for using her death to redirect my life toward work that actually matters. Thank you for the courage to share my story despite the professional cost. Thank you for opening doors I never would have walked through on my own. Thank you for using my scientific training in ways I never imagined. I know there's more ahead, more challenges, more opportunities to share what you've shown me, more people who need to hear that death isn't the end. Keep using me. Keep showing me where you want me to go. Keep giving me courage to follow even when it's hard. Because I've learned something profound. Losing everything I thought mattered, my career as a conventional neuroscientist, the respect of colleagues, the certainty I'd built my life on, none of it compares to what I've gained. Faith, hope, certainty that Lily is alive, purpose in helping others find that same certainty. Thank you for 6 months of learning to live in this new reality, a reality where death isn't the end, where consciousness continues, where love transcends even death itself. Thank you for showing me where Lily is, and thank you for the assurance that someday, not now but someday, I'll hold her again. That hope sustains me, every day, through every moment of grief, through every professional challenge, through everything, because I know it's true. Not because I want it to be, but because you showed me, undeniably, irrevocably, completely. And I'm never going back to the empty certainty I had before, because I've seen the truth. And the truth really has set me free. 6 months after Lily's death, I had become someone unrecognizable from who I'd been. Not the certain atheist neuroscientist who had it all figured out, but a father learning to live with grief and hope intertwined. A scientist investigating the very questions he'd once dismissed. A believer helping others find the certainty he'd discovered. The journey continued, the transformation deepened, the purpose expanded. And through it all, one truth remained constant. Lily was alive, consciousness continued, death wasn't the end, and that changed everything. 9 months after Lily's death, I experienced something that deepened my understanding of what God had shown me. I met another parent whose experience mirrored mine in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Her name was Dr. Jennifer Ross, a clinical psychologist from Seattle. She'd read my published paper on Lily's case and reached out to me through the Division of Perceptual Studies. "Dr. Harrison, I need to talk to someone who understands," her email read. My son died 6 months ago, and like you, I was a skeptic. Not quite an atheist, but agnostic, scientifically minded. And like you, I've had experiences since his death that I can't explain with the psychological frameworks I was trained in. I'd like to meet if you're willing. We scheduled a video call. Jennifer was in her late 30s, composed but carrying the same exhausted grief I recognized from my own mirror. "Thank you for talking with me," she said. "Your paper, it was like reading my own story told by someone else. The skepticism, the desperate need for evidence, the experiences that defy explanation. I thought I was losing my mind until I read what you went through." "Tell me what happened," I said. She took a breath. "My son Alex was 7, leukemia. We tried everything, every treatment, every clinical trial. Nothing worked. He died in my arms at Seattle Children's Hospital 9 months ago." The parallel to Lily's death struck me immediately. "I'm so sorry. I'm a psychologist. I know about grief hallucinations. I know about the brain creating comforting narratives. So when I started having vivid dreams of Alex, I dismissed them as my mind coping with trauma. But then," she paused, struggling with emotion. "Then a stranger approached me at a coffee shop 3 weeks after Alex died. An elderly woman I'd never seen before. She said she'd had a vision of a little boy with red hair who told her to find me and tell me he was okay. She described Alex perfectly, down to the dinosaur shirt he'd been wearing when he died, which hadn't been mentioned in any obituary." My skin prickled with recognition. "Like Margaret. Exactly like Margaret. I read about her in your paper, Dr. Harrison. This woman knew things she couldn't have known. She said Alex wanted me to know that dying didn't hurt, that Jesus was with him, that he was playing with children who'd died before him. She even mentioned his dog, Max, who'd died 2 years earlier. Said Alex was taking care of him. What did you do?" I tried to explain it away, researched cold reading techniques, looked for ways she could have gotten the information, but there weren't any. The details were too specific, too personal. And then I had another dream, different from the others, more vivid, more real. Alex told me the same things the woman had said, and he told me something else, that I needed to find you, that you'd understand what I was going through. I sat back, stunned. He mentioned me specifically. He said, "There's a doctor who lost his daughter. He's a scientist like you, Mommy. He didn't believe either, but now he does. You need to talk to him." That's when I looked you up and found your paper. "Dr. Harrison, I'm a trained psychologist. I know how grief works. I know about wish fulfillment and cognitive bias, but I can't explain these experiences away, and I don't know what to do with that." For the next 2 hours we talked. I shared everything I'd learned over 9 months, the research I'd done, the evidence I'd examined, the conclusions I'd reached, and she shared her own journey from skepticism to reluctant belief. "The hardest part," she said, "is reconciling my professional identity with these experiences. I've spent my career helping clients process grief using evidence-based psychological frameworks. How do I do that now when I know those frameworks are incomplete? When I know consciousness continues beyond death?" I've struggled with the same question, and here's what I've come to. Our professional training isn't wrong. It's just limited. Psychology is excellent at understanding grief as a process. Neuroscience is excellent at studying the brain, but both fields operate under the assumption that consciousness is purely physical. When you encounter evidence that challenges that assumption, you have a choice. Dismiss it to protect your worldview, or expand your worldview to accommodate the evidence. You chose to expand. I did, and it cost me professionally. But it also led me to work that matters more than anything I did before. I'm terrified of what it will cost me, my practice, my reputation, my colleagues' respect. It will cost you, I won't lie about that. But Jennifer, you've encountered the same truth I have. Death isn't the end. Our children are alive. That knowledge is worth any professional price. And there are people who desperately need to hear it from credible professionals like us. People who can't believe it when they hear it from religious leaders, but might believe it coming from scientists who were skeptics. A day after our call, Jennifer and I stayed in touch. She became part of a small but growing network of researchers and professionals who'd encountered evidence for consciousness beyond the brain through personal experience. We supported each other, shared resources, and collaborated on research. But more importantly, we helped each other navigate the tension between professional identity and personal knowledge, between the skepticism we'd been trained in and the evidence we couldn't deny. A month later, Jennifer sent me an email with a subject line that made me smile. "I'm doing it." She'd decided to start incorporating her knowledge of consciousness continuation into her grief therapy practice, not pushing it on clients, but offering it as a framework for those who were open to it. "I had a client yesterday whose daughter died 2 years ago," she wrote. "She'd been stuck in complicated grief, unable to move forward. I shared my story, not as her therapist, but as a mother who'd lost a child, told her about my experiences, about the evidence I'd encountered. Dr. Harrison, I watched her face transform. For the first time in 2 years, she had hope, real hope. Not just that she'd eventually feel better, but that her daughter was actually okay, that she'd see her again. It was the breakthrough she needed." Reading her email, I felt profound gratitude, not just for Jennifer's courage, but for what it represented. God using what he'd shown us to help others, taking the worst thing that had happened to us and redeeming it by making it a source of hope for people drowning in the same despair we'd felt. Around this time, I received an invitation that surprised me. A major television network wanted to interview me about my research for a documentary on consciousness and near-death experiences. "It's a prime-time special," the producer explained. "We're exploring what happens when we die, examining both scientific and spiritual perspectives. Your story, a neuroscientist who lost his daughter and came to believe consciousness continues beyond death based on evidence, it's exactly what we're looking for." I was hesitant. Television was different from academic conferences or church groups. This would be national exposure, millions of people, including countless colleagues who already questioned my credibility, but I also saw the opportunity. How many grieving parents would watch that documentary? How many skeptics who needed to hear that death wasn't the end from someone who'd been just as skeptical as they were? I agreed to the interview. The filming took place at the Division of Perceptual Studies. The interviewer, a veteran journalist named David Chen, had done his homework. He'd read my papers, talked to my colleagues, researched my background. "Dr. Harrison, you built your career on the assumption that consciousness is purely physical. What made you change your mind?" I told the story again. Lily's death, the dream, Margaret's vision. But this time, I also shared the broader context. The research I'd done since, the hundreds of similar cases I'd examined, the growing body of evidence that consciousness might not be reducible to brain activity. "Some of your former colleagues say you've let grief compromise your scientific judgment," David said. "How do you respond to that?" "I'd say I've let evidence challenge my assumptions. That's what science is supposed to do. For years, I operated under the assumption that consciousness must be purely physical, but I never seriously examined evidence that challenged that assumption. I just dismissed it. Now I've looked at that evidence rigorously, and I've reached a different conclusion. That's not compromised judgment, that's following where the evidence leads. But isn't it convenient that you reached this conclusion after your daughter died? That you came to believe in an afterlife right when you desperately needed there to be one? Of course it's convenient. It's also true. The two aren't mutually exclusive. Yes, I desperately wanted Lily to still exist. But the evidence I encountered didn't come from my desperation. It came from external sources I couldn't control or manipulate. Margaret's vision provided specific, verifiable information she had no normal way of knowing. That's evidence, regardless of whether I wanted it to be true. What would you say to grieving parents watching this? I looked directly at the camera. I'd say what I wish someone had told me when Lily died. Death isn't the end. It's a transition. Your child is still conscious, still aware, still themselves, just in a different form of existence. They're not suffering. They're not afraid. They're experiencing joy and love beyond anything we can imagine here, and you will see them again. Not because it's a comforting story, but because consciousness continues beyond the death of the brain. I know this not just from faith, but from evidence, from my own experience, and from hundreds of documented cases that point to the same conclusion. Adil. When the interview aired 2 months later, 11 months after Lily's death, the response was overwhelming. The network received thousands of emails from viewers. My inbox flooded with messages from grieving parents, from skeptics questioning their materialism, from researchers interested in my work. But the most impactful message came from a man named Thomas Rodriguez. Dr. Harrison, my name is Tom. I'm a physicist at Stanford. I watched your interview last night. 3 years ago, my wife died of cancer, and I've been where you were, certain that death was the end, that consciousness was just brain activity, that there was no afterlife. Your interview shook me, not because you converted me, I'm still skeptical, but because you showed me that a rigorous scientist can encounter evidence that challenges materialism and follow it honestly. You've given me permission to look at my own experiences, dreams of my wife, moments where I've felt her presence without immediately dismissing them. I don't know where this will lead, but thank you for showing me it's possible to be both scientifically rigorous and open to consciousness beyond the brain. I responded to Tom, and we began a correspondence that would lead to collaboration on research examining the intersection of physics and consciousness. But more than that, his email reminded me of why I'd been willing to risk my reputation to share what I'd learned. Because there were people out there, skeptics, scientists, grieving parents, who needed to hear that it was possible to follow evidence, even when it led somewhere uncomfortable, that changing your mind based on new data wasn't weakness, it was intellectual honesty. That same month, I was invited to speak at a medical school about end-of-life care and consciousness. The audience was doctors, nurses, and medical students, people who dealt with death regularly but were trained to view it purely physically. I shared my story and then talked about the implications for medical practice. When you're caring for dying patients, you're not just managing biological processes, I said. You're attending to conscious beings who are about to undergo a transition, and the evidence suggests that consciousness continues through and beyond that transition. How might that change how you approach end-of-life care? How might it affect what you say to patients and families? A hospice nurse raised her hand. I've been doing this work for 20 years, and I've seen things I can't explain. Patients who seem to see deceased loved ones in their final hours, people who suddenly become lucid after days of confusion right before they die, patients who wait to die until specific family members arrive. I've always explained these as neurological phenomena. But listening to you, I wonder if I've been dismissing evidence because it doesn't fit my medical training. That's exactly what I did for decades, I said. And it took losing my daughter for me to start taking that evidence seriously. You don't have to wait for personal tragedy. You can start examining these phenomena now with the same rigor you apply to other medical observations. The conversation that followed was rich and substantive. Medical professionals sharing experiences they'd witnessed but never seriously investigated. Questions about how to balance scientific medicine with openness to consciousness beyond the brain. Discussion about how this understanding could improve end-of-life care. Afterward, the hospice nurse approached me. Thank you. You've given me permission to take seriously what I've been seeing for years. And more importantly, you've shown me how to help families who are losing loved ones, not just by managing symptoms, but by helping them understand that death is a transition, not an ending. That evening, I called Rachel. I think I'm finally understanding why God allowed Lily to die. Not because it was good, it's the worst thing that's ever happened to us, but because He's using it, using what He showed me to help countless others, grieving parents, skeptical scientists, medical professionals, people who desperately need to know death isn't the end. You've found redemption in the tragedy, Rachel said quietly. Not that it makes losing Lily okay, but that God is bringing something good out of something terrible. Exactly. And that helps. It doesn't take away the grief, but it gives it meaning. It makes her death and our suffering count for something beyond just loss. That night I prayed with a depth of understanding I hadn't had before. God, I'll never understand why you allowed Lily to die, why you didn't heal her, why you let a 5-year-old suffer with brain cancer. Those questions still haunt me. But I'm starting to see what you're doing with what happened. How you're using her death to give hope to people who have no hope. How you're using my story to help skeptics like me see that consciousness continues. How you're opening doors I never could have opened on my own. Jennifer finding courage to help her clients. Tom beginning to reconsider his materialism. That hospice nurse learning to see death as transition. Hundreds of grieving parents finding hope through the documentary. Thousands of people encountering evidence they'd previously dismissed. All of it flowing from the worst day of my life. All of it redeemed by what you showed me. That doesn't make it okay. I still miss Lily every day. Still wish she was here. Still struggle with the unfairness of losing her. But it makes it bearable. Knowing she's alive. Knowing she's joyful. Knowing her death is being used to help others. Thank you for that, for redemption, for purpose, for meaning emerging from tragedy. Keep using me. Keep using her story. Keep using what you've shown me to help everyone who needs to hear it. Because if one parent finds hope, if one skeptic starts questioning their certainty, if one dying person understands they're transitioning rather than ending, then speaking up, risking my reputation, sacrificing my career, all of it is worth it. Use me however you want. I'm yours, completely, forever. Because you showed me where Lily is, and that changes everything. 9 months after Lily's death, the transformation continued, not just in what I believed, but in who I'd become and what I was doing. A scientist helping others see evidence they'd dismissed. A father using his grief to give others hope. A skeptic showing other skeptics that changing your mind based on evidence is strength, not weakness. The journey wasn't over. More people to help, more research to do, more doors to walk through. But I was walking it with purpose, with hope, with certainty that death wasn't the end, and with profound gratitude for a God who'd shown me where my daughter was, and was using that revelation to help countless others. 1 year after Lily's death, I returned to Boston for the first time since moving to Virginia, not for work, but for something more personal, to visit Lily's grave on the anniversary of her passing. Rachel flew in from Boston. She'd stayed there to finish some projects before our move became permanent. We met at the cemetery on a cold October morning, exactly 1 year after we'd buried our daughter. Standing at her grave, reading the inscription, "Lily Marie Harrison, beloved daughter, now dancing with Jesus," I felt the full weight of a year of transformation. 12 months ago, I'd stood in this same spot, certain that Lily had simply ceased to exist, that the body in the ground was all that remained of my brilliant, curious, beautiful daughter. The grief had been unbearable because it had been hopeless. Now, standing here again, I still grieved. The loss was still crushing. I still missed her physical presence with an ache that hadn't diminished. But the grief was different, because I knew this grave didn't contain Lily, just the body she'd inhabited for 5 years. The real Lily, her consciousness, her personality, her essence was alive, more alive than she'd ever been here. "A year," Rachel said quietly, taking my hand. "I can't believe it's been a year." "Neither can I. It feels like yesterday, and like a lifetime ago at the same time. Do you ever doubt it? What God showed you, what Margaret told you?" I thought about her question carefully. I have moments where the scientific skeptic in me tries to resurface, where I question whether I interpreted the evidence correctly. But then I remember the specificity of what Margaret knew, details she couldn't have accessed, the timing of everything, the consistency of the evidence I've examined since. And I know, as certainly as I know anything, that consciousness continues, that Lily is alive. I wish I'd had what you had, the dream, the vision, the undeniable proof. You had faith before I did. You believed when I was certain it was all delusion. But it was hard faith, faith without proof. And there were times, so many times, when I wondered if I was just telling myself comforting lies because the truth was too painful. And now I have both, faith and evidence. Because what God showed you, it's evidence for me too. And Rachel, that changes everything. I don't just believe anymore, I know. We stood there in silence for a while, each processing a year of grief and transformation in our own way. Then I did something I'd been planning for weeks. I pulled out my phone and opened a recording app. "What are you doing?" Rachel asked. "Something I should have done months ago. I want to talk to Lily. I know she can't respond, not in a way I can hear right now, but I believe she can hear me, and I want to tell her what this year has meant, what God has done, how He's used her death." I pressed record and spoke, my voice breaking with emotion. "Hi, sweetheart. It's Daddy. It's been a year since you left, a year since I held you as you took your last breath, a year since my world fell apart. I wish you were here. I wish I could see you, hear your laugh, answer your endless questions about dinosaurs and stars. I wish I could watch you grow up, go to school, discover the world. I miss you every single day. But Lily, I want you to know something. When you died, I thought death was the end. I thought you just stopped existing, and that belief almost destroyed me. But God showed me I was wrong. He sent Margaret to tell me you were alive. He gave me dreams, where you told me you were okay. He's shown me over this past year, through research, through evidence, through hundreds of cases like yours, that consciousness continues, that you're really, truly alive. And baby girl, I want you to know what that's meant, not just for me, but for so many people. Because I've shared our story. I've told people about how you died and what God showed me. And Lily, hundreds of parents who lost children have found hope because of your story. Hundreds of people who thought their children had just ceased to exist now know they're alive. They know they'll see them again. I've talked to scientists who've started questioning their materialism because of what happened to us. I've helped medical professionals understand that death is a transition, not an ending. I've given people permission to believe what they desperately wanted to believe but couldn't, because I was the biggest skeptic, and even I couldn't deny the evidence. Your death broke my heart, but God has used that brokenness to bring hope to people who had none. And sweetheart, I think that would make you happy, because you always wanted to help people. Remember how you'd share your toys with kids at the park? How you'd ask me to give money to homeless people? How you cried when you saw sad things on TV? That beautiful, compassionate heart, it's still having an impact, even from heaven, even through death. God is using your story to help people. And I think, if you could talk to me right now, you'd say, "That's good, Daddy. I'm glad my dying helps people." I love you, Lily. I love you so much. And I'll see you again. Not today, not anytime soon. I still have work to do here. But someday, and when that day comes, I'm going to hold you and never let go. Thank you for the 5 years I got to be your daddy. Thank you for teaching me more about love than I'd learned in 42 years before you were born. Thank you for changing me, not just through your life, but through your death. Dance with Jesus, sweetheart. Play with the other kids. Take care of Max, and know that Daddy loves you and believes in you and knows you're alive. I'll see you again. I promise. Because death isn't the end. You proved that. God proved that. And I'm never forgetting it. I love you, baby girl. Forever and always. I stopped the recording, tears streaming down my face. Rachel was crying too, holding me as we both grieved and hoped at the same time. After a while, we left the cemetery and went to a cafe nearby, the same one where I'd met Alex, Margaret's son, months ago after her vision. "What are you thinking?" Rachel asked as we sat with coffee. "I'm thinking about how much has changed in a year. I was an atheist neuroscientist who thought death was the end. Now I'm a researcher investigating consciousness beyond the brain, speaking at churches, helping grieving parents find hope. My entire life has been rebuilt from the ground up. Do you regret the change? The cost to your career? Not for a second. I lost a career I'd built over decades, but I gained something infinitely more valuable: truth, understanding, purpose, and the certainty that Lily is alive and I'll see her again. What about the future? Where do you see this going? I want to keep doing what I've been doing. Research at the division, speaking to anyone who'll listen, helping people understand that death isn't the end. But I also want to do something bigger. Like what? I want to write a book, not just an academic paper, but a book for general audiences, something that combines my story with the scientific evidence, something that helps both skeptics and believers understand that consciousness continues beyond death, something that gives hope to anyone who's lost someone they love. You should do it. Your story needs to be told more widely. There's something else. I've been talking with Jennifer and a few other researchers who've had similar experiences. We're thinking about starting a foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to researching consciousness beyond the brain and supporting people who've lost loved ones, combining rigorous science with compassionate care. That's ambitious. It is. But Rachel, I've seen how many people need this. How many are drowning in grief because they believe death is the end. How many have had experiences that suggest their loved ones are still conscious but are afraid to talk about it? If we can create a space where people can explore these questions honestly, where they can encounter evidence without judgment, where they can find both scientific rigor and spiritual hope, that could help so many people. Then do it. God didn't show you what He showed you just for your own comfort. He showed you so you could help others. That afternoon, I met with Pastor David from the church I'd attended before moving to Virginia. He'd been instrumental in helping me navigate my early faith, and I wanted to update him on the year's journey. "Robert, you look different," he said as we sat in his office. "Not just physically, though you do look healthier than when I last saw you, but there's something else. Peace, maybe. I think there is. I'll always grieve Lily, but I'm not destroyed by it anymore. I know where she is. I know she's okay, and I've found purpose in sharing what God showed me. Tell me about the year." I spent an hour sharing everything: the move to Virginia, the research at the division, the speaking engagements, the documentary, meeting Jennifer, the plans for the book and foundation. "You've become an evangelist," Pastor David said with a smile. "The atheist neuroscientist has become one of the most effective evangelists I know. I'm just sharing what I've experienced and learned. That's what evangelism is. And Robert, you're uniquely positioned to reach people who'd never listened to a traditional preacher. Skeptics, scientists, intellectually minded people who need evidence. You're showing them that faith and reason aren't enemies, that you can be rigorously scientific and still believe in God, in the afterlife, in the continuation of consciousness. I never imagined this would be my life. God rarely calls us to what we imagine. He calls us to what we need to become, and you've become someone who can bridge worlds that usually don't communicate: science and faith, skepticism and belief, grief and hope. What do I do with that? Keep doing what you're doing. Keep sharing your story. Keep conducting rigorous research. Keep showing people that death isn't the end. And trust that God will continue to open doors you can't yet see. That evening, Rachel and I had dinner with several people who'd been part of my journey. Pastor David, Dr. Williams from the MIT conference who'd admitted her own experience, a couple from the grief support group who'd found hope through my story. As we talked and shared, I realized something profound. I wasn't alone in this anymore. A year ago, I'd felt isolated in my grief and my new beliefs, a scientist whose colleagues thought he'd lost his mind, a new believer who didn't fit comfortably in traditional church settings. But now I was part of a community, people who'd had similar experiences, people who understood the tension between scientific training and spiritual knowledge, people who were navigating the same questions I was. Dr. Williams shared an update. The research group we started has grown to 12 researchers across 6 institutions. We're investigating consciousness beyond the brain with the same rigor we'd apply to any scientific question. And we're finding remarkable consistency in the evidence. The couple from the grief group shared how their lives had changed. We're not just surviving our daughter's death anymore. We're living with hope, We volunteer with other bereaved parents, sharing what you shared with us, and we've seen so many people find the same hope we found. Listening to them, I felt overwhelming gratitude. God had taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and was using it to create ripples of transformation that kept spreading. Later that night, back in the hotel room, I knelt beside the bed and prayed, God, 1 year ago today, you took my daughter. And I was angry at you, or I would have been if I'd believed you existed. I thought Lily's death was the ultimate proof that you either didn't exist or didn't care. But I was wrong. About you, about death, about everything. You didn't take Lily from me. You brought her home to you. You didn't end her consciousness. You freed it. You didn't destroy her. You perfected her. And in my grief, you met me. You showed me proof I couldn't deny. You transformed my understanding of reality. You gave me purpose beyond anything I'd had before. 1 year later, I stand amazed at what you've done, not just in changing my beliefs, but in changing who I am, in using Lily's death to bring hope to hundreds of people, in opening doors I never imagined walking through, in creating community where I felt alone, in giving me work that matters more than anything I did in my previous career. Thank you for Lily, for the 5 years I got to be her father, for the truth you showed me through her death, for the year of transformation, for the people you've brought into my life, for the purpose you've given me. Thank you for proving that death isn't the end, for showing me that Lily is alive and joyful and whole, for the certainty that I'll see her again. I still miss her. I still wish she was here. I still struggle with the unfairness of losing her at 5 years old, but I'm not hopeless anymore. I'm not destroyed. I'm not questioning whether life has meaning, because I know, really truly know, that consciousness continues, that love transcends death, that you are real and good and faithful. Use the next year however you want. Use me to help more people. Use Lily's story to bring more hope. Use the book I'm going to write. Use the foundation we're going to start. Use every opportunity you open, because I've learned something profound this year. The worst thing that ever happened to me has become the source of the most meaningful work I've ever done. That's redemption. That's what you do. You take death and bring life. You take tragedy and bring purpose. You take grief and bring hope. Thank you for 1 year of learning to live in that redemption, and thank you for whatever comes next, because I trust you now. Finally, completely trust you. Even with Lily, even with death, even with grief, even with everything. I trust you because you've proven yourself faithful over and over and over again. Thank you, God, for everything, for all of it, the good and the terrible and the transformative. Thank you for showing me where Lily is, and thank you for using that revelation to change not just my life, but the lives of everyone who hears the story. Use me, all of me, whatever's left of me, however you want. I'm yours, completely, forever. Because you showed me the truth, and the truth really has set me free. 1 year after Lily's death, I had become someone completely unrecognizable from who I'd been. The certain atheist was now a believer helping others believe. The materialist neuroscientist was now a researcher investigating consciousness beyond the brain. The father, drowning in hopeless grief, was now someone helping others find hope. The transformation was complete, but the journey was far from over. There was more work to do, more people to help, more evidence to gather, more hope to share. But I was ready, because I'd learned the truth that changed everything. Death isn't the end. Consciousness continues. Love transcends even death itself. And Lily, my beautiful, brilliant, beloved daughter, was alive, different, but alive. And someday I would see her again. That certainty sustained me, through grief, through work, through everything, because I knew it was true. God had shown me. And I was never going back. 18 months after Lily's death, I stood before the largest audience I'd ever addressed. Over 2,000 people at a national grief and loss conference in Chicago. The event brought together counselors, therapists, medical professionals, clergy, and bereaved families from across the country. The conference organizer had titled my keynote, "When a Skeptic Encounters Evidence, a Neuroscientist's Journey from Materialism to Hope." As I looked out at the faces watching me, some curious, some skeptical, some desperate for the hope I was about to offer, I thought about how impossible this moment would have seemed 2 years ago. 2 years ago, I was an atheist neuroscientist who would have dismissed this entire conference as people grasping for comforting delusions, who would have argued that grief counseling should focus on acceptance of loss, not false hope about an afterlife, who would have viewed anyone speaking about consciousness beyond death as either delusional or a charlatan. Now I was that speaker, and I believed every word I was about to say. "My name is Robert Harrison," I began. 18 months ago, my 5-year-old daughter died in my arms, and I was absolutely certain that when her brain stopped functioning, she ceased to exist. That death was the end, that there was no consciousness, no heaven, no reunion, just nothing. I was wrong. And today, I'm going to tell you why I know I was wrong. Not because I wanted to be wrong, not because grief made me vulnerable to wishful thinking, but because I encountered evidence that I, as a trained neuroscientist and lifelong skeptic, could not explain away. For the next hour, I shared the complete story. Lily's illness and death, my atheism and certainty, the dream that felt different from any dream I'd had, Margaret's vision with its impossible details. The 18 months since of rigorous investigation, research and growing certainty that consciousness continues beyond the death of the brain. But I also shared something I'd been developing over recent months, a framework for understanding grief when you know death isn't the end. Traditional grief counseling focuses on acceptance, I said, accepting that your loved one is gone, accepting that you'll never see them again, moving forward into a life without them. And for people who believe death is the end, that framework makes sense. But what if death isn't the end? What if your loved one is still conscious, still themselves, still aware? That doesn't eliminate grief. I still miss Lily every day. The physical separation is real and painful, but it transforms grief from hopeless to hopeful, from permanent loss to temporary separation, from ending to transition. And that distinction matters, because hopeless grief can destroy you. But hopeful grief, grief that acknowledges the pain while holding on to the certainty of reunion, that's something you can live with, something that can even become purposeful. I saw heads nodding throughout the audience, people taking notes, some crying, some with expressions of relief, like they'd been waiting for permission to believe what they desperately wanted to believe. During the Q&A session, the questions were intense and thoughtful. A grief counselor asked, "How do you help clients who haven't had the kind of undeniable evidence you had, who want to believe their loved ones are still conscious but struggle with doubt?" "I share the broader evidence base," I answered. "Near-death experiences that have been documented and studied, cases of deathbed visions across cultures, terminal lucidity in dementia patients, the consistency of evidence that points toward consciousness continuing. I tell them what I've learned. This isn't just my experience. It's a pattern that emerges when you examine the data honestly, and I encourage them to pay attention to their own experiences, dreams, sense of presence, moments that feel like more than coincidence, not to force belief, but to stay open to evidence." A therapist who'd lost her own child asked, "Don't you think this gives people false hope? What if you're wrong? What if you've misinterpreted the evidence?" "I've asked myself that question 1,000 times," I said honestly, "and here's what I've concluded. If I'm wrong, then I've lived the past 18 months with hope instead of despair. I've helped hundreds of people find comfort in their darkest moments. I've conducted rigorous research that's expanded our understanding of consciousness. What's the downside? But if I'm right, and I believe with everything in me that I am, then I've given people the truth that death isn't the end, that their loved ones are alive, that they'll be reunited, and that truth is worth any risk of being wrong. After the keynote, the line of people wanting to talk with me stretched out the door. For 3 hours, I listened to stories, answered questions, offered hope to people drowning in grief. A mother whose teenage son had died by suicide. Everyone tells me he's in hell because of how he died. But you're saying consciousness continues regardless of how someone dies. I'm saying God's love and mercy are bigger than our theological categories. If God showed me that my 5-year-old daughter is alive and joyful with Jesus, I believe he's capable of the same love and mercy for your son. Don't let anyone's limited theology steal your hope. A father whose daughter had died of cancer. I've had dreams of her, dreams that felt different, more real, more vivid, but I've been dismissing them as just my brain missing her. What if they're not just your brain? What if your daughter is actually communicating with you? Pay attention to those dreams. Write them down. Don't dismiss them just because they don't fit materialist assumptions. An elderly woman whose husband had died after 60 years of marriage. I'm not afraid of dying anymore, because if what you're saying is true, death means I get to see him again. That's exactly right. Death isn't something to fear. It's a transition, a doorway, a homecoming. That evening, I had dinner with several researchers I'd been collaborating with, people from the Division of Perceptual Studies, Jennifer Ross, who'd become a close colleague and friend, Dr. Williams from MIT, and others who were investigating consciousness beyond the brain. "Robert, your keynote was transformative," Dr. Williams said. "I watched professionals who've spent their careers counseling grief walk out with completely different frameworks for understanding loss. You've changed the conversation. It's not just me, it's all of us. The research we're doing together, the evidence we're accumulating, the cases we're documenting. I'm just the one willing to stand on a stage and talk about it publicly." Jennifer smiled. "Don't minimize what you're doing. You're giving people permission to believe what they've experienced but been afraid to trust. That's powerful." "Speaking of which," I said, "I have an update on the book. My publisher says it's on track for release in 6 months. They're calling it Beyond the Brain, a neuroscientist's evidence for consciousness after death." "That's a bold title," one researcher commented. "It's an honest title, because that's what the evidence shows when you examine it rigorously." "And the foundation?" Dr. Williams asked. "We're close. The paperwork is almost complete. The Lily Harrison Foundation for Consciousness Research and Grief Support. Our mission, to conduct rigorous scientific research on consciousness beyond the brain while providing evidence-based support for grieving families. We launch officially in 3 months. The conversation continued for hours, discussing research projects, sharing cases, planning collaborations. These were my people now. Not the colleagues who dismissed me when I'd started questioning materialism, but a growing community of serious researchers willing to follow evidence wherever it led. The next morning, I did something I'd been planning for months. I visited the hospital where Lily had died. Not the research hospital where I used to work, but the children's hospital where she'd spent her final weeks. I met with the head of pediatric oncology, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, who'd been Lily's primary oncologist. "Dr. Harrison, it's good to see you," she said, though I could see the wariness in her eyes. She'd probably heard about my transformation and wasn't sure what to make of it. "I wanted to thank you," I said, "for everything you did for Lily, for fighting for her even when the odds were impossible, for making her comfortable in her final days. I wish we could have saved her." "So do I. But Dr. Mitchell, I also wanted to share something with you. Something I've learned since Lily died." I told her about my journey, the evidence I'd encountered, the research I'd been doing, the conclusions I'd reached about consciousness continuing beyond death. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked carefully. "Because you work with dying children every day, and I suspect you've seen things you can't quite explain with purely medical frameworks. Deathbed visions, terminal lucidity, children who seem to see deceased relatives, am I right?" She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Yes, more times than I can count. We usually just note it in the charts as confusion or hallucination, but sometimes Sometimes it doesn't feel like hallucination. It feels like they're seeing something real. What if they are? What if consciousness continues beyond the brain and dying patients are beginning to perceive that reality? How might that change how you approach end-of-life care for children and their families? It would change everything. Instead of just managing symptoms and preparing families for loss, we'd be helping children transition to, what? Heaven? Another form of existence? I can't tell you exactly what happens, but I can tell you what the evidence suggests. That consciousness continues, that these children you care for don't just cease to exist when their brains stop. They transition to a different form of life. And if that's true, wouldn't families benefit from knowing it? Wouldn't it help them to understand their child's death as a transition rather than an ending? Dr. Mitchell leaned back in her chair. You're asking me to completely rethink how I approach my work. I'm asking you to consider evidence you might have been dismissing, and to think about how that evidence could help the families you serve. Give me some time. This is a lot. Of course. But Dr. Mitchell, if you ever want to talk more about this, if you want to see the research we're doing, or hear about the cases we've documented, my door is open. As I left the hospital, I felt a sense of completion. I'd come full circle. From the neuroscientist who believed death was the end, to the grieving father who'd encountered evidence he couldn't deny, to someone who could now help medical professionals see what I'd taken 18 months to learn. That afternoon, I flew back to Virginia. Rachel met me at the airport. She'd permanently moved to Virginia now, and we'd settled into our new life there. How was Chicago? She asked as we drove home. Powerful, exhausting, meaningful. I spoke to over 2,000 people. The response was incredible. So many people desperate for hope, finding it in evidence they'd been afraid to trust. You're making a real difference, Robert, changing how people understand death and grief. We're making a difference. This is our journey, not just mine. Lily was your daughter too. The grief is yours too. And the hope, that's for both of us. That evening, I went into what had become my writing space. A room in our new house where I worked on research, prepared talks, and wrote the book that was nearing completion. On the wall, I'd hung a large photo of Lily from her 4th birthday party. She was wearing a princess crown and laughing at something I'd said. Every time I looked at it, I felt both grief and hope intertwined. I opened my laptop and pulled up the final chapter of the book. It was titled simply, Living with Hope. I'd been struggling to find the right words to conclude the book. How do you end a story that hasn't really ended? How do you wrap up a journey that's ongoing? And then I realized I didn't need to provide closure. I needed to provide direction, not an ending, but an invitation. I began typing, 18 months ago, I held my daughter as she died, and I believed with absolute certainty that death was the end. That her consciousness, her personality, her essence, everything that made her Lily, simply ceased to exist when her brain stopped functioning. I was wrong, not because I wanted to be wrong, but because I encountered evidence I couldn't dismiss. Evidence that has been corroborated by hundreds of similar cases. Evidence that points unmistakably toward one conclusion. Consciousness continues beyond the death of the brain. If you're reading this book because you've lost someone you love, I want you to know, they're not gone, they're different. They're in a different form of existence, but they're still conscious, still themselves, still aware, and you will see them again. That's not a comforting story I'm telling you to make you feel better. That's the conclusion I've reached after 18 months of rigorous investigation as a neuroscientist trained in skepticism. Death isn't the end. It's a transition, a doorway, a homecoming. And knowing that, really knowing it, not just hoping it might be true, changes everything. It doesn't eliminate grief. I still miss Lily every single day. The physical separation is real and painful. But it transforms grief from hopeless to hopeful, from permanent loss to temporary separation, from ending to until we meet again. And that transformation makes grief something you can live with, something that can even become purposeful. My daughter's death broke my heart, But God used that brokenness to show me truth I'd spent 42 years denying. Truth about the nature of consciousness, truth about what happens when we die, truth about his existence and love and faithfulness. And he's used that truth, shared through my story, to give hope to hundreds of people who thought death was the end. That's redemption, taking the worst thing that ever happened and using it to bring good to others. If you're grieving right now, I want to offer you the same hope I've found. Your loved one is alive. Death didn't end them, it freed them, and the separation you're experiencing is temporary. Stay open to evidence. Pay attention to dreams that feel different. Notice moments of presence. Don't dismiss experiences just because they don't fit materialist assumptions. And most importantly, trust that love transcends even death itself. Because I've learned something profound in these 18 months. The bonds of love we form here don't break when someone dies. They continue, they persist, they endure. My daughter is gone from this physical world, but she's not gone from my life. She's still my daughter, I'm still her father. That relationship continues, even across the boundary of death. And someday, not now, but someday, I'll hold her again. Not the sick, dying version I said goodbye to 18 months ago, but the radiant, healed, perfected version she is now. That's the hope I'm offering you. Not wishful thinking, but evidence-based certainty. Death isn't the end. Consciousness continues. You will see your loved ones again. Believe it. Trust it. Live in that hope. Because it's true, and the truth really will set you free. I saved the file and leaned back in my chair looking at Lily's photo. I finished the book, sweetheart, I said out loud. Your story, our story, what God showed us. It's going to help so many people, just like you would have wanted. That night, Rachel and I sat on our back porch, a ritual we'd developed in Virginia, just as we'd had in Boston. I've been thinking about Lily, Rachel said, about what she'd be like now if she'd lived. She'd be almost 7, first grade, learning to read, still asking a million questions about dinosaurs. I think about that too. All the milestones we're missing, all the moments we won't get to experience, but we will experience them, just not here. Someday when we're with her again, we'll get to know who she's become, what she's learned, how she's grown. Do you think people grow in heaven, change, develop? I don't know, but I believe she's not static. That consciousness continuing means ongoing existence, ongoing experience. And I trust that wherever she is, whatever she's doing, she's more fully herself than she could ever be here. We sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Rachel asked, "Do you ever regret it? The cost of following the evidence, your career, your colleagues' respect, all of it?" Not for a second. I lost a career I'd built over decades, but I gained truth, I gained purpose, I gained the certainty that Lily is alive and I'll see her again. That's worth any professional price. What about the future? Where do you see this going? I want to keep doing what I'm doing. The research, the speaking, the foundation, the book, helping people understand that death isn't the end. But more than that, I want to keep following wherever God leads. Because 18 months ago, I didn't believe he existed. Now he's directing my entire life, and his plans have been better than anything I could have designed. That night I prayed one final time in this chapter of the journey. God, 18 months ago, you shattered my certainty. You showed me I was wrong about everything I'd believed for 42 years. You proved that consciousness continues, that Lily is alive, that you are real. It's been the hardest 18 months of my life. Losing Lily, grief that still crushes me some days, sacrificing my career, facing skepticism from colleagues, learning to live with hope and heartbreak intertwined. But it's also been the most meaningful 18 months of my life, because you've given me purpose beyond anything I had before. You've used Lily's death to bring hope to hundreds of people. You've opened doors I never imagined walking through. You've transformed not just what I believe, but who I am. Thank you for Lily, for every moment I got to be her father, for the 5 years of her life and the 18 months since her death, for using both to teach me truth I desperately needed to learn. Thank you for proving that death isn't the end, for showing me where she is, for the certainty that I'll see her again. Thank you for redemption, for taking the worst thing that ever happened to me and using it to bring good to others. The book is finished. The foundation is launching. The research continues. The speaking goes on. All of it flowing from what you showed me in my darkest moment. Use it all however you want. Use me however you want. I'm yours completely, because you've proven yourself faithful, over and over and over again. I trust you with my past. I trust you with my present. I trust you with my future. I trust you with Lily, with my grief, with my hope, with everything, because you've shown me the truth, and the truth really has set me free. Thank you, God, for everything, for all of it, for taking a broken atheist neuroscientist and transforming him into someone who knows, really truly knows, that death isn't the end, that consciousness continues, that love transcends even death, that you are real and good and faithful. I believe, finally, completely, irrevocably believe. And I'm never going back to the empty certainty I had before, because I've seen the truth, I've encountered the evidence, I've met you, and nothing will ever be the same again. Thank you for showing me where Lily is. Thank you for the assurance that someday, not now, but someday, I'll hold her again. That hope sustains me through everything, always, because I know it's true. Death isn't the end, and that changes everything, forever. 18 months after his daughter died in his arms, Dr. Robert Harrison had become someone completely unrecognizable from who he'd been. The certain atheist neuroscientist was now a believer helping others believe. The man who'd thought death was the end was now proving it was a beginning. The grieving father, drowning in hopeless despair, was now giving hope to hundreds of others. His daughter was gone from this physical world, but she wasn't gone from his life. She was alive, different but alive, and someday he would see her again. That certainty, that evidence-based, rigorously examined, undeniable certainty, sustained him through everything, through grief that would never fully fade, through work that would continue for the rest of his life, through every moment of missing her, because he knew the truth. Death wasn't the end. Consciousness continued. Love transcended even death itself, and God, the God he denied for 42 years, had shown him all of it. By breaking his heart, by shattering his certainty, by giving him evidence he couldn't dismiss, by showing him where his daughter was. And Robert was grateful for all of it, even the worst parts, even the grief, even the loss, because it had led him to truth, and the truth really had set him free, forever.